Marriage is supposed to be built on trust, love, and protection. The person you choose to spend your life with should be your safest place in a dangerous world. But for the families we're covering today, the greatest threat didn't come from a stranger or an enemy. It came from the father figure meant to protect them. The man they called Dad, the person they trusted completely. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary rage. These were calculated acts of violence that destroyed entire bloodlines, committed by men who once promised to provide and protect, and the courts made sure those broken promises resulted in the harshest punishment possible, ensuring they would never walk free again. Today we're covering every father who went from loving dad to family killer. What you're about to hear will shatter any illusions you have about the men who transformed from devoted fathers into stone-cold murderers, and the ultimate betrayal that landed them in a cell forever. Case number 1. Scott Falater seemed to have it all figured out. He was a devoted Mormon, a successful product engineer at Motorola, and by all accounts, a loving husband and father. He and his wife Yarmila had been married for 20 years, raising 2 kids in their quiet Phoenix suburb. Neighbours described them as the picture-perfect family. Scott was the kind of guy who helped out at church functions, never raised his voice, and seemed genuinely content with his life. There were no red flags, no warning signs, nothing that suggested the violence that was about to shatter everything. On the night of January 16th, 1997, something happened that would challenge everything people thought they knew about Scott Falater. His neighbour Greg Coons was in his backyard when he heard splashing coming from the Falater pool. It was around 10:30 at night, which struck him as odd. When he looked over the fence, what he saw stopped him cold. Scott Falater was in the pool area, and there was a woman in the water. Greg watched as Scott held the woman underwater, pushing her down repeatedly. The scene was surreal, almost dreamlike in how calmly Scott seemed to be acting. Greg immediately ran inside and called 911, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what he had just witnessed. When police arrived at the Falater home just minutes later, they found a scene that would haunt even seasoned investigators. Yarmila Falater was lying in the pool, her body floating face down in the shallow end. She had been stabbed 44 times. The brutality of the attack was overwhelming. The knife wounds covered her chest, neck, and back. This was not a quick killing. This was sustained, methodical violence that had gone on for several minutes. The medical examiner would later determine that Yarmila had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, meaning she had been conscious and fighting for her life as her husband attacked her. The police found Scott inside the house, appearing confused and disorientated when they confronted him. He was wearing different clothes than what Greg Coons had described seeing. His original outfit, soaked with blood and pool water, was discovered stuffed in the wheel well of his Volvo parked in the driveway. The knife used in the attack was found in a Tupperware container in the same wheel well, carefully placed as if someone had been trying to hide evidence. Scott's bandaged hand caught the attention of investigators. When they asked about it, he claimed he had cut himself while working on the pool pump earlier that day. The timing seemed suspicious given what had just happened. When detectives began questioning Scott at the police station, he told them something that seemed impossible to believe. He claimed he had no memory of killing his wife. According to Scott, he had been sleepwalking. He said the last thing he remembered was working on the pool pump in the late afternoon, and then he woke up in jail with no idea how he got there. He appeared genuinely shocked when investigators told him his wife was dead. His reaction seemed authentic enough that it gave some officers pause, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The investigation into Scott Falater revealed a man who seemed completely ordinary in every way. His co-workers at Motorola described him as reliable, intelligent, and pleasant to work with. He had been with the company for years and had a solid reputation. His friends from the Mormon church painted a similar picture. Scott was active in his faith community, regularly attending services and participating in church activities. He taught Sunday school and was known for his patience with the children. Nothing in his background suggested violence or instability. There were no reports of domestic abuse, no history of mental illness, and no criminal record of any kind. But as detectives dug deeper, they found some details that complicated the picture. Scott had been under significant stress at work. Motorola was going through restructuring, and his job security was uncertain. He had been working long hours, trying to prove his value to the company. Friends mentioned that he seemed tired all the time, running on minimal sleep as he juggled work demands and family responsibilities. Yarmila had also been dealing with her own challenges. She worked as a teacher and was pursuing additional education to advance her career. The couple had been stretched thin, though nothing suggested their marriage was in serious trouble. The sleepwalking defense that Scott's attorneys would eventually present was not pulled out of thin air. Scott had a documented history of sleepwalking going back to his childhood. His parents confirmed that he would frequently walk around the house at night, sometimes performing complex actions while completely asleep. As an adult, the behavior had continued. There were instances where he had gotten dressed, gone outside, and even driven short distances while asleep. Yarmila had told friends about finding Scott doing strange things in the middle of the night, like rearranging furniture or organizing items in the garage, with no memory of it the next morning. Medical experts who examined Scott after his arrest found evidence supporting a diagnosis of sleep disorder. Sleep studies conducted on him showed that he suffered from a condition that caused him to act out during deep sleep stages. During these episodes, a person can perform surprisingly complex tasks while their conscious mind remains completely shut down. They can walk, talk, and interact with their environment in ways that appear purposeful, but they have no control over their actions and no memory of them afterward. The condition is rare, but well documented in medical literature. The prosecution faced a challenge that was almost unprecedented. They had a defendant who admitted to killing his wife, but claimed he had no conscious awareness of doing it. The physical evidence clearly showed Scott had committed the murder. His DNA was all over the crime scene. His clothes were soaked in his wife's blood, and a neighbour had literally watched him drown her in the pool. But proving that he had done it intentionally, with malice and premeditation, required showing he had been awake and aware during the attack. If the jury believed he had been genuinely sleepwalking, they might find him not guilty by reason of insanity or some lesser charge. Prosecutors brought in their own sleep experts who argued that the complexity of Scott's actions that night proved he could not have been asleep. They pointed out that he had changed clothes after the murder, hidden evidence in his car, and cleaned up the scene. These were calculated actions that required planning and awareness. A sleepwalker, they argued, simply could not perform such a sophisticated cover-up. They emphasised that Scott had first attacked Yarmila in their backyard, stabbing her repeatedly with a hunting knife. When she tried to escape, or when he thought she might still be alive, he dragged her to the pool and held her underwater to ensure she was dead. This showed intent and determination. The defence countered with testimony from sleep specialists, who explained that sleepwalkers can indeed perform remarkably complex behaviours. There are documented cases of people cooking entire meals, having conversations, and even driving cars while in a sleep state. The actions appear purposeful because the motor functions of the brain are active, but the parts of the brain responsible for judgment, decision-making, and memory formation are shut down. Scott's history of sleepwalking episodes gave credibility to this explanation. His defense team argued that something had triggered an unusually severe episode that night, possibly related to his exhaustion and stress. One detail that emerged during the investigation added another layer to the case. Scott had been wearing his garage work clothes when he attacked Yarmila. These were the same clothes he had worn earlier that day, when he claimed to have been working on the pool pump. Some theorized that in his sleep state, his mind had somehow confused the pool pump repair with his wife, creating a bizarre scenario where he acted out a violent dream or hallucination. The theory was that he believed he was fixing something, or defending himself against a threat that existed only in his sleeping mind. The trial of Scott Fallata became a media sensation. It was one of the first cases to prominently feature the sleepwalking defense, and the public was fascinated by the question of whether someone could commit such a brutal murder while genuinely unconscious. Court TV broadcast the proceedings, and legal analysts debated the merits of the defense on talk shows across the country. The case raised fundamental questions about criminal responsibility and the nature of consciousness itself. If Scott really had been asleep, could he be held morally responsible for his actions? Did he deserve the same punishment as someone who had intentionally murdered their spouse? During the trial, the jury heard from Scott's children, who testified about their father's sleepwalking history. They described finding him wandering around the house at night, sometimes having full conversations that he would not remember the next day. One of his kids recalled an incident where Scott had gone outside in the middle of winter wearing only his underwear, apparently responding to some dream scenario. These testimonies painted a picture of a man whose sleep disorder was a regular part of family life, something they had all learned to manage and work around. Yarmila's family members testified about the woman they had lost. They described her as a dedicated mother, a passionate teacher, and the kind person who had devoted her life to her family and her students. They spoke about how excited she had been about her future plans, and how much she had loved Scott, despite the normal stresses of married life. The pain in their voices was evident as they tried to make sense of how the man Jarmila had trusted and loved for 2 decades had become the person who took her life in such a violent way. The prosecution brought up another angle that they felt undermined the sleepwalking defense. They presented evidence that Scott had seemed to take steps to avoid detection after the killing. He had not just changed his clothes, but had specifically hidden the bloody garments in a place where they would not be immediately discovered. The knife had been placed in a container, suggesting he was trying to prevent blood from getting elsewhere in the car. These actions, prosecutors argued, showed a guilty mind trying to escape consequences. A person who was truly asleep and unaware of what they had done would not think to hide evidence. Medical testimony became the centerpiece of the trial. The defense's sleep experts testified at length about the science of parasomnia, the category of sleep disorders that includes sleepwalking. They explained how the brain can essentially split during these episodes, with primitive motor centers active while higher cognitive functions remain dormant. They showed the jury brain scans and sleep study results from Scott's evaluations. One expert testified that Scott's sleep disorder was so severe that he could potentially harm someone during an episode without any awareness or control. The prosecution's experts challenged every aspect of this testimony. They argued that true sleepwalking rarely involves such sustained and violent behavior. Most sleepwalking episodes last only a few minutes and involve relatively simple actions. The attack on Jarmila had been prolonged and had required Scott to maintain focus through multiple phases. First the stabbing, then dragging her body to the pool, then holding her underwater until she drowned, then changing clothes and hiding evidence. This sequence, they insisted, was beyond what any sleepwalker could accomplish without conscious awareness. One of the most damning pieces of evidence the prosecution presented had to do with the timeline of events. Greg Coons had seen Scott holding Jarmila underwater in the pool, but the autopsy showed she had been stabbed dozens of times before she ended up in the water. This meant Scott had attacked her somewhere else first, probably in the backyard, and then moved her to the pool. The prosecution argued that this showed planning and awareness. A sleepwalker experiencing a random violent episode would not have the presence of mind to move a victim to a different location and use a different method to ensure death. The defense had an explanation for this too. They argued that sleepwalking episodes can include what seem like purposeful movements and decisions, but are actually just the brain responding to stimuli in a basic, automatic way. If Jarmila had been moving or making sounds after the initial attack, Scott's sleeping brain might have perceived her as a continued threat or problem that needed to be addressed. Moving her to the pool and drowning her could have been an extension of the same unconscious episode, rather than a separate, conscious decision. Throughout the trial, Scott maintained his position that he had no memory of that night. He took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that his attorneys felt was necessary given the unusual nature of his defense. He testified about his history of sleepwalking, describing various incidents and the confusion he would feel upon waking in strange places or situations. When asked about the night Jarmila died, he became emotional. He said he loved his wife, that they had been planning their future together, and that he would never have consciously hurt her. His pain appeared genuine, and some courtroom observers found his testimony compelling. But under cross-examination, prosecutors hammered away at inconsistencies and improbabilities in his story. They pointed out that despite his claims of having no memory, he had been lucid enough to hide evidence immediately after the killing. They questioned why, if he had such a severe sleep disorder, he had never sought serious medical treatment for it before. They suggested that his sleepwalking history was being exaggerated or misrepresented to create reasonable doubt. Most devastatingly, they kept returning to the sheer brutality of the attack. 44 stab wounds was not the action of someone in an unconscious state. It was rage, they argued, pure and intentional rage. The jury deliberated for several days. They asked to review the neighbour's testimony, the medical evidence, and the crime scene photos. The question they were wrestling with was not whether Scott Falater had killed his wife. That was not in dispute. The question was whether he had been conscious and aware when he did it. If they believed he had been sleepwalking, they would likely find him not guilty by reason of insanity, or possibly guilty of a lesser charge like manslaughter. If they believed he had been awake and aware, even for part of the attack, they would find him guilty of first-degree murder. On June 25, 1999, after more than 2 years of legal proceedings, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Scott Falater guilty of first-degree murder. The decision indicated that they did not believe his sleepwalking defense. Despite the medical testimony and his documented history of sleep disorders, the jury concluded that the evidence showed he had been conscious and in control during at least part of the attack on Jarmila. The verdict meant Scott would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge sentenced Scott to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, the judge acknowledged the unusual nature of the case, but stated that the evidence supported the jury's conclusion. He noted that regardless of Scott's sleep history, the actions taken that night showed awareness and intent. The systematic nature of the attack, the attempt to ensure Jarmila was dead by drowning her after stabbing her, and the hiding of evidence all pointed to a conscious mind making decisions. After the conviction, some sleep disorder experts expressed concern that the verdict might discourage future defendants with legitimate sleep disorders from receiving fair consideration. They worried it set a precedent that juries would be unwilling to accept parasomnia defences, even when they were supported by medical evidence. Others in the legal community argued that the verdict was appropriate given the specific facts of the case, and that it did not necessarily close the door on sleepwalking defences in situations where the evidence was more clear-cut. Scott Falater has spent over 2 decades in prison. He continues to maintain that he has no memory of killing Jarmila, and that he was experiencing a severe sleepwalking episode. In various interviews conducted from prison over the years, he has expressed remorse for his wife's death, while insisting he was not consciously responsible for it. He has said that waking up in jail and learning what happened was like waking into a nightmare that never ended. Some people who have followed his case believe him. Others remain convinced that the sleepwalking defense was a calculated attempt to avoid responsibility for murder. The impact on the Falater children was devastating. They lost their mother in a horrifically violent way, and their father was sent to prison for life. They were forced to grapple with the impossible question of whether their dad had murdered their mum while awake or asleep, and what it meant either way. Some family members have supported Scott over the years, believing in his innocence and advocating for his case to be reconsidered. Others have maintained distance, unable to reconcile the loving father they knew with the man who killed their mother. The case remains one of the most discussed examples of the sleepwalking defense in American legal history. It is frequently cited in law schools and medical schools as a case study in the intersection of sleep science and criminal law. The questions it raised about consciousness, responsibility, and the reliability of medical testimony in court continue to be debated. For the legal system, it highlighted the challenges of cases where the defendant's mental state, rather than their physical actions, is the central question. Jarmila Falater's death and the trial that followed left a mark on everyone involved. The investigators who worked the case have spoken about how the sleepwalking angle made what seemed like a straightforward murder case into something much more complex. The jurors who had to decide Scott's fate carried the weight of that decision with them, and the community that knew the Falaters as a normal, happy family struggled to understand how something so terrible could happen to people who seemed so ordinary. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 2. Case number 2. Christian Longo appeared to have everything a young father could want. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Mary Jane Baker, and together they had 3 beautiful children. Zachary was 4 years old, Sadie was 3, and Madison, their youngest, was just 2. To those who knew them casually, the Longos seemed like a typical young family trying to make their way in the world. Christian was involved with the Jehovah's Witnesses, often going door to door to share his faith. He seemed devoted to his family and his religion, presenting himself as a man who valued morality and righteousness above all else. But beneath this carefully constructed surface, Christian Longo was living a completely different reality. He was deeply in debt, having run up massive credit card bills and defaulted on loans. He had been fired from multiple jobs for stealing from his employers. In one instance, he stole tools and equipment from a construction company where he worked. In another, he forged checks while working at a publishing company. His financial problems kept mounting, and instead of facing them honestly, he kept lying and stealing to maintain the appearance of stability. Mary Jane knew about some of the problems, but Christian kept much of it hidden from her, always promising things would get better. By late 2001, the Longo family was living in a small rental house in Newport, Oregon, a quiet coastal town. They had moved there after fleeing Michigan, where Christian had been caught in another scheme. He had been working at a Starbucks when he was caught stealing money from the register. Rather than face the consequences, he convinced Mary Jane they needed to start fresh somewhere else. She went along with it, hoping that a new location would finally allow them to build the stable life she wanted for their children. But Christian's pattern of lies and theft continued in Oregon. In early December 2001, Christian's landlord began pressing him for overdue rent. The family was facing eviction, and Christian had no way to pay. His credit cards were maxed out, and he had burned through every financial resource available to him. He had also been stealing from his latest employer, a local warehouse, but that income was not enough to cover his mounting debts. The pressure was building, and Christian knew that his house of cards was about to collapse completely. He had no job prospects, no money, and a family depending on him. But instead of asking for help or declaring bankruptcy or finding some legitimate way forward, Christian began planning something unthinkable. On December 17, 2001, Christian Longo killed his entire family. The details of what happened that night are horrifying in their brutality and calculation. He strangled Mary Jane first, likely while she was in bed. She was 25 years old. The medical examiner would later determine that she fought back, evidenced by defensive wounds on her body, but Christian overpowered her. After killing his wife, he then turned to his children. He strangled 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie in their beds. These were his own children, kids he had held as babies, kids who trusted him completely. The murders were not quick or impulsive. Strangling someone takes sustained effort and time. Christian had to maintain pressure on each victim's neck for several minutes while they struggled and died. After killing Zachary and Sadie, Christian stuffed their small bodies into suitcases. He then took 2-year-old Madison, who may have witnessed part of what happened to her siblings, and put her in the family minivan, along with the suitcases containing her brother and sister. He drove to the Lint-Slough Bridge, a remote area outside Newport. There, he weighted down the suitcases with rocks and threw them into the cold water. Madison was still alive at this point. Christian tied her to a rock and threw her into the water as well, drowning her. She was 2 years old, barely more than a baby, and her father murdered her by throwing her into freezing water to die alone in the dark. Christian then drove back to the rental house and retrieved Mary Jane's body. He put her in the minivan and drove to Alsea Bay, another body of water near Newport. He weighted her body down and pushed it into the bay. With his entire family dead and disposed of, Christian returned to the house one more time. He packed up anything valuable that he could sell or use, loaded it into the minivan, and drove away. He showed no signs of panic or remorse. Instead, he executed what appeared to be a pre-planned escape. Christian drove south, eventually abandoning the family minivan in California. He sold or pawned various items for cash, then purchased a plane ticket to Mexico. But before leaving the country, he did something that revealed just how calculated and cold his thinking was. He stole the identity of a New York Times journalist named Michael Finkel. He had apparently read some of Finkel's articles and decided the identity would be useful. Christian used Finkel's name to rent accommodation and meet people, presenting himself as a travel writer taking a break from the stress of journalism. Back in Newport, Christian's co-workers and acquaintances started to notice the family was gone. The Longos had told some people they were going back to Michigan for the holidays, but something felt off. On December 27th, just 10 days after the murders, a couple was walking along the beach near Lint-Slough when they discovered a disturbing sight. A small suitcase had washed up on the shore, and inside were the bodies of Zachary and Sadie Longo. The children were still in their pajamas. The discovery was immediately reported to police, who launched a full investigation. Within hours, investigators found the second suitcase containing more evidence from the crime scene. They quickly identified the children and rushed to the Longo rental house. The house was empty, abandoned in a hurry with belongings scattered around. There was no sign of Mary Jane, Madison, or Christian. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office immediately issued a warrant for Christian Longo's arrest and began a nationwide manhunt. They suspected he had killed all 4 family members, though they had not yet found Mary Jane or Madison's bodies. On January 11, 2002, nearly a month after the murders, a man fishing in Alsea Bay made a grim discovery. He found Mary Jane's body floating in the water. She had been weighted down, but the weights had shifted and her body rose to the surface. This confirmed what investigators already believed. Christian Longo had murdered his entire family. Madison's body was found a few days later in the same area, also weighted down and left in the water like her mother. While Oregon investigators were piecing together the crime, Christian was living in Cancun, Mexico, using Michael Finkel's identity. He had checked into a youth hostel and was spending his days lounging on the beach, drinking at bars, and socializing with other travelers. He told people elaborate stories about his work as a journalist, claiming he was taking time off to work on a book. He flirted with young women at the hostel, trying to present himself as an interesting, cultured American taking a sabbatical. Nobody suspected he was a family annihilator on the run from murder charges. Christian's time in Mexico came to an end on January 13, 2002. Someone at the hostel had seen news coverage about the Longo family murders and recognized Christian from the photos being circulated by law enforcement. They contacted the authorities, who coordinated with Mexican police. Christian was arrested at the hostel without incident. When confronted, he did not deny his identity. He was extradited back to Oregon to face 4 counts of aggravated murder. The real Michael Finkel, the journalist whose identity Christian had stolen, was blindsided by the news. Finkel was dealing with his own professional crisis at the time, having been fired from the New York Times for fabricating parts of a story. When he learned that a man accused of murdering his wife and 3 children had been using his name, he was stunned. Finkel eventually reached out to Christian in jail, beginning a strange correspondence that would later become the basis for Finkel's book about the case. Christian seemed eager to tell his story, though his version of events would prove to be as filled with lies as everything else in his life. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence against Christian Longo. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Christian's fingerprints were found on the suitcases containing his children's bodies. Witnesses placed him at the locations where the bodies were dumped. His flight to Mexico using a stolen identity showed consciousness of guilt. His financial records revealed the mounting debts and thefts that had backed him into a corner. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Christian Longo had murdered his family because they were in his way. He wanted to escape his responsibilities, his debts, and his failures. Rather than face the consequences of his actions or work to support his family, he decided it would be easier to kill them and start over. Christian's defense attorneys faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against him was ironclad, and his flight to Mexico made claims of innocence absurd. Initially, Christian maintained he was innocent, spinning various stories about what might have happened. He claimed at different times that Mary Jane had killed the children and he had panicked, or that he had come home to find them already dead, or that strangers had been involved. None of these stories made any sense given the evidence, and Christian kept changing his version of events depending on who he was talking to. Eventually, Christian changed his strategy. He admitted to killing Mary Jane, claiming they had gotten into an argument that escalated, and he strangled her in a moment of rage. But he continued to deny killing his children, insisting that he found them dead when he came home. This version of events was also impossible to believe. The forensic evidence showed that all 4 victims had been killed in the same time frame and in the same general location. The suitcases, the disposal of the bodies, the methodical cover-up, all pointed to one person being responsible for all 4 murders. Christian's attempts to minimize his responsibility by admitting to one murder while denying the others convinced no one. The trial began in March 2003. The courtroom was packed with journalists, observers, and family members of the victims. Mary Jane's family attended regularly, struggling to maintain their composure as gruesome details about her death and the deaths of the children were presented. Christian sat at the defense table, often appearing calm and occasionally taking notes, as if he was observing someone else's trial rather than his own. His demeanor struck many as cold and detached, showing little emotion even when photos of his dead children were shown to the jury. Prosecutors presented testimony from dozens of witnesses. They called Christian's former employers, who described his thefts and lies. They called people from Michigan and Oregon, who knew the family and described Christian's mounting financial troubles. They called forensic experts who explained how the victims had died and when. They called the people who found the bodies, whose testimony brought several jurors to tears. And they called the people Christian had met in Mexico, who described how he had been living carefree on the beach while his family's bodies were floating in Oregon waters. The defense tried to present Christian as a man who had made terrible mistakes, but had not intended to become a killer. They argued that Mary Jane's death had been unplanned, the result of a domestic dispute that spiraled out of control. They suggested that Christian had panicked after her death and made bad decisions, but that he was not a cold-blooded murderer. They could not explain away the children's deaths convincingly, and their case fell apart under the weight of the evidence. Christian had not accidentally killed 4 people. He had systematically murdered each member of his family and attempted to hide the evidence. Throughout the trial, Christian gave several interviews to the media, including extensive conversations with Michael Finkel. In these interviews, Christian continued to shift his story and manipulate the narrative. He would sometimes appear remorseful, claiming he was haunted by what happened. Other times he seemed more concerned with how he was being portrayed in the press. He told Finkel elaborate stories about his childhood, his marriage, and the events leading up to the murders. But investigators found that much of what he said was either exaggerated or completely false. Christian was a compulsive liar who seemed incapable of telling the truth even when it might have helped him. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all 4 counts of aggravated murder. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence. There was simply no reasonable doubt that Christian Longo had killed his wife and 3 children. The trial then moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Christian should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued that Christian's crimes were particularly heinous and deserved the ultimate punishment. They emphasized that he had killed 3 innocent children, his own children, in cold blood. They pointed out that he had shown no remorse, fleeing to Mexico to party on the beach while his family's bodies decomposed in Oregon waters. They noted that he continued to lie and manipulate even after being caught. The aggravating factors in the case were overwhelming. The defense tried to present mitigating factors that might spare Christian from execution. They called witnesses who testified about Christian's difficult childhood, though the evidence of abuse or trauma was limited. They argued that he was young and could potentially be rehabilitated, though this seemed unlikely given his pattern of behaviour. They emphasised that executing him would not bring back Mary Jane, Zachary, Sadie, or Madison. Ultimately, they asked the jury to show the mercy that Christian had not shown his own family. The jury was not persuaded by the defence's arguments. On April 16, 2003, they returned a sentence of death for Christian Longo. The judge formally imposed the sentence, ordering that Christian be executed by lethal injection. Christian showed little reaction as the sentence was read. He was 29 years old and would be sent to death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary to await execution. Christian's case went through the standard appeals process that follows all death penalty convictions. His attorneys argued various legal points, claiming errors in the trial or problems with how the death penalty was imposed. None of these appeals were successful in overturning his conviction or sentence. The evidence against him was too strong, and the legal process had been followed correctly. Christian remained on death row for years as his appeals wound through the courts. In 2019, Oregon's Governor Kate Brown announced a moratorium on executions in the state. She declared that no executions would be carried out while she remained governor, regardless of the crimes committed or sentences imposed. This effectively commuted Christian's death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though the formal legal sentence remained death. Christian would spend the rest of his life in prison, but he would not be executed. Some people supported the governor's decision, believing the death penalty should be abolished. Others, particularly the families of Christian's victims, felt betrayed by the decision. Mary Jane's family has spoken over the years about the devastating impact of the murders. They lost a beloved daughter, sister, and aunt, along with 3 beautiful children who never got the chance to grow up. They described Mary Jane as a devoted mother who loved her kids more than anything. She had tried to make her marriage work despite Christian's problems, always hoping he would change and become the husband and father she needed him to be. Instead, he killed her and took away the children she had devoted her life to raising. The case attracted significant media attention, partly because of the involvement of Michael Finkel. Finkel wrote a book called True Story about his interactions with Christian and his attempts to understand how someone could murder their entire family. The book was later adapted into a film starring James Franco as Christian Longo and Jonah Hill as Michael Finkel. The movie focused more on the relationship between Finkel and Christian than on the murders themselves, which some critics felt was inappropriate given the tragedy at the heart of the case. Christian has given numerous interviews from prison over the years, continuing his pattern of manipulation and self-serving narratives. He has at various times claimed deep remorse, offered different explanations for why he killed his family, and presented himself as a changed man who deserves forgiveness. People who study the case remain skeptical of anything Christian says, given his history of pathological lying. He has never provided a fully honest account of what happened and why, always leaving out details or shifting blame in subtle ways. The Longo case is often studied by criminologists and psychologists who specialize in family annihilators. Christian fits a particular profile of these killers. He was facing financial ruin and public exposure of his lies and crimes. Rather than face the shame and consequences, he chose to eliminate his family and start over. This type of killer often sees their family as extensions of themselves, rather than as separate people with their own rights and lives. When their carefully constructed false identity is about to collapse, they destroy everything associated with that identity, including the people closest to them. What makes Christian particularly disturbing is the level of premeditation and the coldness of his actions. The murders were not committed in a sudden rage or moment of psychotic break. He methodically killed each family member, disposed of their bodies in separate locations, stole an identity, and fled the country. After the murders, he showed no signs of psychological distress or breakdown. He partied in Cancun, flirted with women, and presented himself as a carefree traveller. This suggests a profound lack of empathy and connection to his victims, even though they were his own wife and children. The community of Newport, Oregon was shaken by the murders. It is a small town where violent crime is rare, and the idea that someone could murder 3 small children and dump their bodies like garbage was incomprehensible to residents. The locations where the bodies were found became places of mourning, with people leaving flowers and teddy bears in memory of Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. The case remained in the local news for months as the trial proceeded and details emerged. Christian Longo remains incarcerated in Oregon, where he will spend the rest of his life. He is now in his 50s, having spent more than 2 decades behind bars. He will never be released. He will never have another opportunity to harm anyone, but he also never has to face execution, which some people believe is an injustice given what he did. The debate over whether he deserved death or life in prison continues among those who followed the case. The 3 children Christian murdered never got to experience life beyond early childhood. Zachary was only 4, Sadie was 3, and Madison was 2. They never went to kindergarten, never learned to read, never made friends outside their family, never got to discover what they wanted to be when they grew up. Mary Jane never got to see her children grow up, never got to escape the troubled marriage she was trapped in, never got to rebuild her life. 4 people who should still be alive were killed by someone who was supposed to love and protect them above all else. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 3. Case number 3. Ronald Gene Simmons was a retired Air Force Master Sergeant living in rural Pope County, Arkansas. He was 47 years old in December 1987, and on the surface seemed like a fairly typical middle-aged man who had served his country and was now living a quiet life with his family. He had been in the military for over 20 years before retiring in 1979. After leaving the service, he had worked various jobs and eventually settled on a remote property in the Ozark Mountains with his wife Rebecca and several of their children and grandchildren. The property was isolated, accessible only by a rough dirt road, which suited Ronald's desire for privacy and control. But the Simmons household was far from normal. Ronald ruled his family with absolute authority, backed by violence and fear. He was tyrannical and abusive, controlling every aspect of his family members' lives. He did not allow his children to have friends or leave the property without permission. He monitored their activities constantly and enforced strict rules through physical punishment. Former neighbours and acquaintances would later describe an atmosphere of terror in the Simmons home, where everyone walked on eggshells around Ronald, afraid of triggering his anger. The abuse in the Simmons family went far beyond typical domestic violence. Ronald had been sexually abusing his daughter Sheila for years, beginning when she was a child. The abuse was an open secret within the family, though the children were too terrified to report it to authorities. In 1981, when Sheila was 17, she became pregnant with her father's child. She gave birth to a daughter, and the baby was raised as another of Rebecca's children to hide the incestuous relationship. 3 years later, in 1984, Sheila became pregnant by Ronald again and gave birth to a son. Both children were living in the Simmons household in 1987, being raised by their mother Sheila and their grandmother Rebecca, who was also their step-grandmother, since Ronald was their biological father. By late 1987, the situation in the Simmons family had reached a breaking point. Sheila had managed to escape her father's control. She had moved away from the property and was living independently with a man Ronald did not approve of. Other adult children had also left home and were building lives separate from their father's control. Ronald perceived this as a betrayal and loss of the absolute authority he believed he deserved over his family. He had become increasingly paranoid and angry, convinced that family members were talking about him or planning something against him. His mental state was deteriorating, and those who knew him noticed he was becoming more withdrawn and hostile. On December 22, 1987, Ronald began executing a plan he had apparently been considering for some time. He started by killing his wife Rebecca, who was 46 years old. He strangled her to death. With Rebecca dead, he then turned on his other family members who were living on the property. Over the next several days, he systematically killed everyone who came to the family compound. Some victims were strangled, others were shot, and some were killed with blunt force trauma. Ronald was methodical and patient, waiting for family members to arrive and then murdering them. His son, Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., known as Gene, was the next to die. Gene was 26 years old and had come to visit the family property. Ronald killed his eldest son shortly after murdering Rebecca. He then killed his 3-year-old grandson, Sylvia Gale, one of the children born from his incestuous relationship with Sheila. The little girl was strangled to death. Next was his son Billy, who was 21 years old. Billy was shot and killed when he arrived at the property. As the days passed, more family members arrived at the Simmons property for what they thought would be a Christmas gathering. None of them knew that Ronald had already begun his killing spree. His daughter Loretta, who was 17 years old, was killed when she arrived. His son Eddie, who was 14, met the same fate. His daughter Marianne, who was 19, was murdered along with her husband Dennis McNulty, who was 33. The young couple had no chance to defend themselves or escape. Ronald's son Trey, who was only 6 years old, was killed. His daughter Rebecca, who was 24, was murdered. His daughter Barbara, who was 16, was killed. His son Michael, who was 3 years old, was murdered. Finally, his daughter Sheila, who was 24 and had endured years of sexual abuse by her father, was killed along with her son Michael Sylvester, who was 21 months old and also Ronald's grandson and son through incest. Ronald killed 14 members of his family on that property over the course of several days. The victims ranged in age from 21 months old to 46 years old. Some were shot, some were strangled, and some were killed by blows to the head. After each murder, Ronald hid the bodies around the property. Some were stuffed into the trunks of cars, some were buried in shallow graves, some were left in the house or outbuildings. He tried to conceal what he had done, apparently hoping to delay discovery long enough to carry out the next phase of his plan. On December 26th, having murdered his entire family, or at least everyone he could get his hands on, Ronald left the property and drove into Russellville, Arkansas, a town about 30 miles away. He was not finished killing. He went to the offices of J&G Cable Company, a business where a woman named Kathy Kendrick worked. Kathy was 24 years old and had previously worked with one of Ronald's relatives. Ronald believed she had somehow wronged him or his family, though the exact nature of his grievance was never entirely clear. He walked into the office and shot Kathy Kendrick to death with a handgun. He then calmly left the building. Later that same day, Ronald went to a law office in Russellville, where a man named Jim Chaffin worked. Jim was 53 years old and was an attorney who had represented Ronald's family in some legal matter years earlier. Again, Ronald felt he had been wronged by this person, though his reasons seemed disconnected from reality. He entered the office and shot Jim Chaffin to death. After these 2 additional murders, Ronald went to a local bar called Sinclair Tavern and sat down to wait. He ordered drinks and seemed calm and relaxed, as if he had just completed routine errands rather than murdered 16 people. Police were called to the cable company office and the law office after the shootings. Witnesses described the shooter and his vehicle. When officers arrived at Sinclair Tavern acting on a description, they found Ronald sitting at the bar drinking beer. He did not resist arrest. When officers approached him, he reportedly said something to the effect of, he had gotten everyone he wanted to get. He was taken into custody without incident and transported to the police station. During initial questioning, Ronald confessed to killing Kathy Kendrick and Jim Chaffin. He provided details about how and why he had killed them, though his explanations made little sense. When investigators asked if there was anything else they needed to know, Ronald mentioned that there were some people dead at his property in Pope County. The casual way he mentioned having killed his entire family shocked the detectives. They immediately contacted Pope County authorities and directed them to the Simmons property. What law enforcement found at the Simmons compound was one of the worst mass murder scenes in American history. Bodies were scattered across the property in various states of decomposition. Some had been dead for days in the December cold. The scene was chaotic and horrifying, with victims of all ages, from a baby to middle-aged adults. Investigators had to carefully document and recover each body, determining causes of death and trying to piece together the timeline of when each person had been killed. The sheer number of victims and the family relationship between them and the killer made this an unprecedented case. Ronald was charged with capital murder for the deaths of 16 people. Arkansas law allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty in cases involving multiple murders. Given the scope of Ronald's crimes and the complete lack of any mitigating circumstances, prosecutors immediately announced they would pursue execution. The case was almost impossible to defend. Ronald had confessed to all the murders. Physical evidence tied him to each killing. There were no questions about his guilt, only questions about what his punishment would be. Ronald's trial began in 1989. The proceedings were complicated by the sheer number of victims and charges. Prosecutors had to present evidence for each individual murder, establishing not just that Ronald had killed these people, but that he had done so with premeditation and malice. The defense had virtually nothing to work with. They could not claim innocence. They could not argue self-defense. The best they could do was try to present evidence of mental illness or diminished capacity, hoping to avoid the death penalty even if conviction was inevitable. The defense called mental health experts who testified that Ronald suffered from various personality disorders and possible mental illnesses. They argued that his military service, particularly any trauma he may have experienced, had affected his mental state. They pointed to his increasingly paranoid and isolated behaviour in the years before the murders as evidence he was not thinking rationally. But prosecutors countered that Ronald had been fully aware of what he was doing. He had planned the murders, carried them out methodically over several days, and then calmly gone into town to kill 2 more people he believed had wronged him. This showed intent, planning, and awareness of his actions. The jury heard testimony about the abuse Ronald had inflicted on his family for years. They learned about the sexual abuse of his daughter Sheila and the incestuous children born from that abuse. They heard about the atmosphere of fear and control Ronald had maintained in his household. They saw photographs of the crime scenes and heard from the medical examiner about how each victim had died. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who was not insane or out of control, but rather someone who was evil and had chosen to murder his family rather than lose his power over them. The evidence of what Ronald had done to his family before killing them was particularly damning. The years of abuse, the incest, the complete domination of every family member's life, all pointed to someone who saw his family as property rather than as people. When they began to assert independence, or when he felt his control slipping, he chose to destroy them. The 2 murders in Russellville were similarly motivated by a desire to punish people Ronald felt had disrespected him or failed to show him proper deference. Every murder was about Ronald asserting his will and punishing those he felt had wronged him. The trial lasted several weeks, due to the complexity of handling so many murder charges at once. The jury heard from dozens of witnesses and reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence. Throughout the proceedings, Ronald showed little emotion. He sat at the defense table looking bored, or occasionally seeming to smirk, as if he found the whole process beneath him. His attitude did nothing to help his case. If anything, it reinforced the prosecution's argument that he was a callous killer who felt no remorse for what he had done. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, they did not take long to reach a verdict. They found Ronald guilty on all 16 counts of capital murder. The convictions meant he was eligible for the death penalty on each count. The trial then moved to the sentencing phase, where the jury would decide whether Ronald should be executed or spend the rest of his life in prison. Given the number of victims, their ages, the family relationships, and the complete absence of any justification for the murders, the outcome was never really in doubt. The jury recommended death for Ronald Gene Simmons. The judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Ronald showed no reaction to the sentence. He was transported to death row at the Arkansas Department of Correction to await execution. Under Arkansas law, death penalty cases received automatic appeals, and Ronald's case began working through the appellate courts. What happened next was unusual and controversial. Ronald decided he did not want to appeal his death sentence. He actively fought efforts by his attorneys to challenge the conviction or delay the execution. He stated publicly that he wanted to die and that he deserved to be executed for what he had done. He filed legal motions asking courts to stop his lawyers from filing appeals on his behalf. This created a complex legal situation where the defendant was essentially volunteering for execution, while his attorneys were trying to save his life against his wishes. The courts had to determine whether Ronald was mentally competent to waive his appeals. If he was insane or unable to understand the legal process and consequences, then his waiver could not be accepted. Mental health evaluations were conducted, and experts testified about Ronald's mental state. Ultimately, the courts determined that while Ronald may have suffered from personality disorders and other mental health issues, he was competent enough to understand that he was sentenced to death and that waiving appeals would result in his execution. His decision to volunteer for execution was deemed legally valid. Ronald's decision to accept his death sentence and refuse appeals sparked debate among legal scholars and death penalty opponents. Some argue that the state should not execute someone who essentially wanted to commit suicide through the criminal justice system. Others felt that regardless of the defendant's wishes, the death penalty itself was wrong and should not be carried out. But victims, family members and prosecutors argued that Ronald had earned his death sentence through his actions, and that allowing him to be executed was justice, regardless of whether he personally wanted to die. On June 25, 1990, less than 3 years after the murders, Ronald Gene Simmons was executed by lethal injection at the Arkansas State Penitentiary. He was 54 years old. He made no final statement and showed no emotion as the execution was carried out. He was pronounced dead shortly after the procedure began. His execution came remarkably quickly compared to most death penalty cases, which typically take many years or even decades to reach conclusion due to lengthy appeals. Ronald's decision to waive his appeals and volunteer for execution had dramatically shortened the timeline. The impact of Ronald's crimes on the surviving family members and the community was devastating and long-lasting. Some of his children had not been at the property during the killing spree and survived. They had to cope with the knowledge that their father had murdered most of their family, including their mother, siblings, nieces, and nephews. The trauma of losing so many loved ones at once in such a violent way was almost incomprehensible. Survivors struggled with guilt about not being there, anger at their father, and grief for the family members they lost. The community of Russellville in Pope County was shocked by the scale of the violence. Mass murders of this magnitude were extremely rare, especially in rural areas. The randomness of the 2 murders in town, where Ronald had killed people who had only tangential connections to him, created fear that anyone could have been a target. People who had known Ronald or done business with him wondered if they had been on some list in his mind. The sense of safety that existed in the small community was shattered. The case attracted significant national media attention. News outlets covered the story extensively, focusing on the unprecedented number of family victims and the incestuous abuse that had preceded the murders. Criminologists and psychologists studied the case, trying to understand what had driven Ronald to such extreme violence. The case became a reference point in discussions about family annihilators, domestic abuse, and the warning signs of mass violence. In the years since Ronald's execution, the case has continued to be studied and discussed. It remains one of the worst family mass murder cases in American history in terms of the number of victims. The fact that Ronald killed family members ranging from a baby to middle-aged adults, that he did it methodically over several days, and that he then went out to kill 2 more people before calmly waiting to be arrested, made the case particularly disturbing. It represented an extreme case of a family annihilator who destroyed not just his immediate family, but extended relatives and even people outside the family who he felt had wronged him. The abuse Ronald inflicted on his family before killing them raised important questions about how such situations can be identified and stopped before they escalate to murder. His daughter Sheila had endured years of sexual abuse and had given birth to 2 of her father's children, yet no one outside the family had intervened or reported the abuse to authorities. The isolation of the family property and Ronald's tight control over family members made it difficult for anyone to escape or seek help. The case highlighted how domestic abuse and incest can remain hidden even when multiple people are aware of it. Some survivors and extended family members later spoke about the warning signs they had seen, but not fully understood. They described how Ronald had become increasingly paranoid and controlling in the months before the murders. He had made comments about family members betraying him and had expressed anger at people he felt had disrespected him, but no one imagined he was capable of mass murder. The progression from abusive tyrant to family annihilator happened gradually enough that people around him failed to recognize how dangerous he had become until it was too late. The 2 victims outside the family, Kathy Kendrick and Jim Chaffin, became part of the case almost by accident. Their murders seemed to be the result of perceived slights or grudges that existed primarily in Ronald's mind. Kathy had worked with or known some of Ronald's family members, and he apparently blamed her for some unspecified wrong. Jim Chaffin had been an attorney involved in some legal matter concerning the Simmons family years earlier, and Ronald had nursed a grudge about it. Both victims had moved on with their lives, and likely had not thought about Ronald in years when he showed up and killed them. The speed of Ronald's execution compared to typical death penalty cases was noteworthy. Most people sentenced to death spend 10 to 20 years or more on death row, while their cases work through various levels of appeals. Ronald's decision to waive his appeals and accept his death sentence meant he was executed in under 3 years. This raised ethical questions about whether the justice system should accommodate defendants who volunteer for execution, or whether all death penalty cases should go through full appeals, regardless of the defendant's wishes. Ronald Gene Simmons took the lives of 16 people over the course of about a week in December 1987. 14 of those victims were members of his own family, ranging from his 21-month-old grandson to his 46-year-old wife. 2 were acquaintances or business associates who had the misfortune of being on his mental list of people who had wronged him. Every victim had been living normal lives, looking forward to Christmas, making plans for the future, and had no idea they were about to be murdered by someone they knew. The randomness and brutality of it all left scars on the survivors and the community that have never fully healed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 4. Case number 4. James Urban Ruppert was 40 years old and living a life that had gone nowhere. He was unemployed, unmarried, and living in his childhood home in Hamilton, Ohio. He shared the house with his older brother Leonard, Leonard's wife Alma, and their 8 children. The living arrangement was a source of constant tension and humiliation for James. He was the younger brother who had failed at everything, while Leonard had a job, a wife, and a large family. James had never married, never held down a steady job, and was completely dependent on his family for housing and financial support. James had been living this way for years, stuck in a pattern of unemployment and isolation. He had a college degree in engineering from Xavier University, but he had never successfully launched a career. He would get jobs and then lose them, always blaming others for his failures. By 1975, he had been unemployed for several years and was living off disability payments and whatever money his mother Charity gave him. Charity Ruppert was an elderly woman who lived next door to the house where James and Leonard's family resided. She owned both properties and had allowed James to stay in the family home despite the problems it created. The relationship between James and his brother Leonard was strained at best. Leonard was the successful one, the one who had built a normal life with a wife and children. He had a good job working as a supervisor at a General Electric plant. He provided for his family and was respected in the community. James, on the other hand, was seen as the family failure. He was socially awkward, had few friends, and spent most of his time alone in his room. The contrast between the two brothers was stark, and James felt it every single day. James had developed a deep paranoia over the years. He believed people were talking about him, plotting against him, and trying to make him look bad. He was convinced that Leonard and other family members were conspiring to have him thrown out of the house or committed to a mental institution. There was no evidence for these beliefs, but James had constructed an elaborate narrative in his mind where he was the victim of various plots and schemes. His isolation and lack of social connections had allowed these paranoid thoughts to grow unchecked. On the evening of March 29, 1975, James went to a local bar and spent several hours drinking alone. This was typical behaviour for him. He would go out, have a few drinks, and then return home to his room where he would continue drinking and brooding. When he got home that night, he went to his bedroom on the second floor of the house. His room was cluttered with guns. James was an avid gun collector and had accumulated a significant arsenal of firearms over the years. He had rifles, pistols, revolvers, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The guns were his hobby, perhaps his only real interest besides drinking. The next day was Easter Sunday, March 30th, 1975. It was supposed to be a day of celebration and family gathering. Leonard and Alma's children ranged in age from 4 to 17. The family had plans to have Easter dinner together, and Charity Ruppert was expected to come over from next door to join them. The house was full of the sounds of children getting ready for the holiday. Leonard was home from work, and the family was preparing for what should have been a normal Easter celebration. James woke up that morning and the paranoid thoughts that had been building for years reached a breaking point. He later claimed that he overheard Leonard and Alma talking about him, saying negative things and plotting to get rid of him. Whether this conversation actually happened, or was a product of James's paranoid imagination, remains unclear. What is certain is that something in James's mind snapped that morning. He decided he was going to kill his entire family. James went to his room and gathered his guns. He loaded multiple firearms and prepared for what he was about to do. Around 11 in the morning, he left his room and went downstairs where his family was gathered. What happened next was methodical and horrifying. James began shooting everyone in the house. He started in the living room, where some family members had gathered, firing repeatedly at anyone he saw. The victims had no warning and no chance to defend themselves or escape. Leonard Ruppert was 41 years old when his brother shot him to death. Alma Ruppert was 38. Their children were also killed, one by one, as James moved through the house. 17-year-old Leonard Jr. was shot and killed. 16-year-old Teresa was murdered. 15-year-old Carol was shot to death. 14-year-old Thomas was killed. 12-year-old John was murdered. 9-year-old Anne was shot and killed. 8-year-old David was murdered. 4-year-old Michael, the youngest child, was shot to death. James did not stop with Leonard's family. His mother Charity, who was 65 years old, had come over from next door when she heard the gunshots. She entered the house trying to understand what was happening, and James shot her as well. In total, James murdered 11 members of his family in a matter of minutes. He used 3 different firearms during the massacre, reloading as needed and systematically going through the house to make sure everyone was dead. After the shooting stopped, James sat down in the house surrounded by the bodies of his family members. He did not immediately leave or try to escape. Instead, he called the police himself. When the dispatcher answered, James calmly reported that he had just killed his family. He gave his name and address and told the operator to send police. His tone was matter of fact, showing no emotion or panic. He then sat and waited for the authorities to arrive. Police responded to the call within minutes. When they arrived at the house on Minor Avenue in Hamilton, they found a scene of unimaginable carnage. Bodies were scattered throughout the first floor of the house. Blood was everywhere. Shell casings littered the floor. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Officers had to carefully clear the house, not knowing if the shooter was still armed or if there might be additional victims. When they found James, he was sitting calmly and surrendered without resistance. The guns he had used were nearby, and he admitted immediately that he had killed everyone. The investigation that followed was relatively straightforward in terms of determining what had happened. James had called police himself and confessed. The physical evidence showed he had shot all 11 victims using guns from his collection. Autopsies confirmed that each victim had died from gunshot wounds, most shot multiple times. The children had been killed where they stood or sat, given no opportunity to run or hide. Leonard and Alma had been shot in the living room. Charity had been shot near the front door, where she had entered the house after hearing the gunfire. What made the case complex was determining James's mental state and whether he could be held legally responsible for the murders. James's attorneys immediately raised the issue of insanity. They argued that their clients had been suffering from paranoid schizophrenia or some other serious mental illness that had prevented him from understanding the wrongness of his actions. They pointed to his history of unemployment, social isolation, bizarre beliefs about conspiracies against him, and the irrational nature of the murders as evidence he was insane. James himself gave multiple explanations for why he had committed the murders. In some statements, he claimed he had heard Leonard and Alma talking about having him committed to a mental hospital. In other accounts, he said they were planning to kick him out of the house. He talked about feeling persecuted and believing his family was against him. He described hearing voices or having thoughts that told him he needed to act. His stories were inconsistent and often contradictory, making it difficult to determine what, if anything, he genuinely believed versus what he was fabricating to support an insanity defense. The prosecution argued that James was not insane, but rather was a bitter, angry man who had killed his family out of rage and jealousy. They pointed out that he had planned the attack by gathering and loading multiple guns. He had executed the murders methodically, moving through the house and ensuring everyone was dead. After the killings, he had called police himself, showing he understood what he had done and that it was wrong. These actions, prosecutors argued, demonstrated someone who was in control of his faculties and knew right from wrong, even if he was motivated by paranoid and irrational beliefs. James was charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder. Ohio law allowed for the death penalty in cases involving multiple murders, and prosecutors initially indicated they would seek execution. However, as the case developed and the mental health issues became a central focus, the decision on whether to pursue death became more complicated. The trial was delayed multiple times as both sides brought in mental health experts to evaluate James and testify about his competency and sanity. Multiple psychiatrists and psychologists examined James. Some concluded he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia or another serious mental illness that had affected his ability to understand reality. They testified that his paranoid delusions about his family conspiring against him were genuine symptoms of mental illness rather than mere excuses. Other experts who examined him concluded that while James may have had personality disorders and paranoid traits, he did not meet the legal definition of insanity. They argued he knew what he was doing when he killed his family and understood that murder was wrong. The first trial began in 1975, just months after the murders. The proceedings focused heavily on the question of James's sanity. The jury heard testimony about his history of social isolation, his failures in work and relationships, his paranoid beliefs, and his behaviour before and after the murders. They saw crime scene photos showing the bodies of the 11 victims, including the 8 children ranging from 4 to 17 years old. The prosecution emphasised the planning involved and the methodical nature of the killings. The defence emphasised James's mental health history and argued he had been unable to control his actions due to mental illness. The jury in the first trial found James guilty on all 11 counts of murder. However, they did not recommend the death penalty. Whether this was because they believed there was some mental health mitigation, or simply because they felt life in prison was sufficient punishment for someone who was clearly disturbed, the result was that James was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction should have ended the case, but James's attorneys immediately filed appeals, challenging various aspects of the trial. One of the issues raised on appeal was whether James should have been tried separately on charges related to his mother's murder versus the murders of his brother's family. The argument was that trying all 11 murders together had prejudiced the jury against James and prevented him from receiving a fair trial. The appellate courts agreed that this was a problem, and James's conviction was eventually overturned on procedural grounds. A new trial was ordered, this time separating the charges. The second trial focused specifically on the murder of James's mother, Charity Ruppert. This trial also revolved around the question of sanity. Again, mental health experts testified for both sides, offering conflicting opinions about whether James had been legally insane when he committed the murders. The prosecution argued that even if James had mental health problems, he still understood what he was doing and that it was wrong. The defense maintained that his paranoid delusions had made him unable to appreciate the criminality of his conduct. The jury in the second trial also found James guilty of murder. However, they found him guilty of murdering his mother, while not finding him guilty by reason of insanity for the other murders. This created a strange legal situation, where James was convicted for one murder, but found not guilty by reason of insanity for 10 others. He was sentenced to life in prison for Charity's murder. The not guilty by reason of insanity verdicts for the other murders meant he was technically acquitted of those charges, though he would still spend the rest of his life incarcerated. James was sent to the Ohio prison system to serve his life sentence. He was placed in facilities equipped to handle inmates with mental health issues. Over the years, he gave occasional interviews to journalists and researchers interested in the case. In these interviews, he continued to maintain various versions of why he had killed his family. Sometimes he expressed remorse, other times he seemed to justify what he had done by reference to his paranoid beliefs. His mental state in prison appeared to fluctuate, with periods where he seemed more lucid and times when his paranoia and delusions were more prominent. The Easter Sunday Massacre, as it became known, was one of the worst mass murders in Ohio history and one of the deadliest family annihilations in American history at that time. The sheer number of victims, including 8 children, shocked the community of Hamilton and the nation. The case received extensive media coverage and became a subject of study for criminologists and mental health professionals interested in understanding what drives someone to kill their entire family. The surviving family members and the community struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Leonard and Alma's children had been well known in the neighborhood. They attended local schools and were involved in typical childhood activities. Their sudden violent deaths left classmates, teachers, and neighbors traumatized. The house on Minor Avenue where the murders occurred became a grim landmark, a place people would drive by and point to as the site of the terrible Easter Sunday killings. The case raised important questions about how society handles individuals with mental illness, who may pose a danger to others. James had exhibited warning signs for years. He was isolated, paranoid, unemployed, and accumulating weapons, yet no one had intervened or tried to get him professional help. His family may have recognized he had problems, but they likely never imagined he was capable of mass murder. The case highlighted the difficulty of predicting when someone with mental health issues will become violent, and the limitations of the mental health and legal systems in preventing such tragedies. Legal scholars and mental health professionals debated the outcome of James's trials for years. The fact that he was found guilty of one murder, but not guilty by reason of insanity for 10 others, seemed inconsistent to many observers. How could someone be legally insane when killing 10 family members, but sane when killing the 11th? The answer lay in the complexities of how insanity is defined legally and how juries apply that definition. The verdicts reflected the jury's struggle to reconcile James's obvious mental health problems with the calculated nature of his crimes. James spent the remainder of his life in custody. He was moved between various Ohio correctional and mental health facilities over the decades, as his mental and physical health changed. He never expressed full remorse for what he had done, though he occasionally acknowledged the terrible nature of his crimes. His paranoid beliefs about his family persisted to some degree throughout his incarceration, suggesting that whatever mental illness he suffered from had not been fully resolved through treatment or medication. On June 4, 2022, James Urban Ruppert died in custody at the age of 88. He had spent 47 years incarcerated for the Easter Sunday massacre. His death received little media attention beyond brief mentions in Ohio newspapers. By the time he died, most people had forgotten about the case or were too young to remember it. The 11 people he murdered had been gone for nearly half a century, their lives cut short by a man who should have been caring for them rather than killing them. The victims of the Easter Sunday massacre never got to live the lives they should have had. Leonard Ruppert never got to see his children grow up or retire from his job at General Electric. Alma never got to become a grandmother or grow old with her husband. Leonard Jr. was 17 and on the verge of adulthood when his uncle murdered him. Teresa was 16, Carol was 15, Thomas was 14, all teenagers with their whole lives ahead of them. John was 12, Anne was 9, David was 8. All elementary and middle school-aged children who should have had decades of life remaining. 4-year-old Michael was barely more than a baby when his uncle shot him to death. Charity Ruppert was a 65-year-old mother who died trying to understand why her son was shooting her grandchildren. The extended Ruppert family was devastated by the murders. Those who survived lost multiple loved ones in a single day. Some family members refused to ever speak publicly about what happened, trying to move on and forget the horror. Others felt compelled to talk about the victims, to make sure people remembered Leonard, Alma, their children and Charity as real people rather than just statistics in a mass murder case. The trauma rippled through the family for generations, affecting not just those who directly lost relatives, but also their children and grandchildren who grew up with the shadow of the Easter Sunday massacre hanging over their family history. Hamilton, Ohio was forever changed by what happened in that house on Minor Avenue. The city had dealt with crimes before, but nothing approaching the scale of the Ruppert murders. 11 people killed in a matter of minutes by a family member in an apparently planned massacre was beyond anything the community had experienced. Churches held memorial services, schools brought in counselors to help students process the tragedy, and neighbours tried to support each other through the grief and shock. The case became a part of true crime history, studied in criminology courses, and featured in books and documentaries about mass murder and family annihilation. The Easter Sunday massacre was notable not just for the number of victims, but for the family dynamics involved. James had been living with his victims, depending on them for housing and financial support. Yet he had developed such paranoid rage toward them that he decided to kill them all. The case illustrated how family relationships could become toxic, and how mental illness combined with access to firearms could result in catastrophic violence. In the years since the murders, there have been many other cases of family annihilation, but the Ruppert case remains one of the deadliest in terms of victim count. The fact that James killed 11 people, including 8 children, in a single incident shocked the nation in 1975 and continues to be studied as an extreme example of family mass murder. The case raised questions that remain relevant today about mental health, gun access, family dysfunction, and the warning signs of violence that society often fails to recognise or act upon until it is too late. James Urban Ruppert will be remembered as a mass murderer who destroyed his family on Easter Sunday in 1975. His victims will be remembered by those who loved them as real people whose lives were stolen by a man who chose violence over getting help, who chose murder over accepting his own failures, and who inflicted permanent trauma on a family and community that will never fully recover from what he did. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 5. Case number 5. Robert William Fisher appeared to have built a successful life in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was a surgical catheter technician working at the Mayo Clinic, a respected medical institution. He was married to Mary Fisher, a teacher, and together they had 2 children. Brittany was 13 years old and Bobby was 10. The family lived in a comfortable home in an upscale neighbourhood in North Scottsdale. To those who knew them casually, the Fishers seemed like a typical suburban family navigating the normal challenges of work, school, and raising children. But beneath this surface of normalcy, the Fisher marriage was deeply troubled. Robert and Mary had been having serious problems for years. Friends and family members knew the couple fought frequently, and that the relationship had become increasingly strained. Mary had been talking about divorce and had consulted with attorneys about ending the marriage. She had told close friends and family that she was unhappy and wanted out. Robert was strongly opposed to divorce, partly because of his religious beliefs as a devout Catholic, and partly because his own parents had divorced when he was young, an event that had deeply affected him. Robert was described by people who knew him as someone who could be charming and outgoing, but also had a darker side. He was controlling and had a temper. He hunted frequently and was skilled in outdoor survival. He was an avid outdoorsman who spent considerable time camping, fishing, and hiking in the Arizona wilderness. He was knowledgeable about living off the land and was comfortable spending extended periods in remote areas. These skills and interests would later become significant when authorities tried to track him down. The Fisher marriage continued to deteriorate through late 2000 and early 2001. Mary had become more determined to leave the marriage. She had been setting aside money and making plans for how she would support herself and the children after a divorce. She had confided in her mother and siblings about her plans. Robert was aware that Mary was serious about leaving him, and reportedly told several people that he would never allow his family to be broken up by divorce. He said things that suggested he viewed his family as a unit that could not be separated, and some people who heard these comments later said they had been concerned about what Robert might do. On April 10th, 2001, something terrible happened in the Fisher home. The exact sequence of events has never been definitively established because there were no witnesses, and Robert Fisher has never been captured to give his account. What investigators later pieced together from evidence suggests that sometime in the early morning hours, Robert killed his family. Mary Fisher, who was 38 years old, was shot in the back of the head while she was in bed. She was killed instantly. The children, 13-year-old Brittany and 10-year-old Bobby, also had their throats cut. The brutality of the attacks on the children was particularly horrifying. After murdering his wife and children, Robert took steps to destroy the evidence. He placed the bodies together in an upstairs bedroom. He then sabotaged the home's natural gas line, allowing gas to fill the house. He opened the line in the morning, knowing that gas would accumulate throughout the house. Before leaving, he turned on a candle or some other ignition source that would eventually ignite the gas and cause an explosion. The plan was apparently to make the deaths look like an accident, or at least to destroy forensic evidence that would show what he had actually done to his family. Robert then left the house with the family dog, a blue heeler named Blue. He got into Mary's four-wheel drive SUV and drove away from the Scottsdale neighbourhood. The gas continued to leak into the house throughout the morning. Neighbours later reported seeing Robert's truck parked in the driveway earlier that day, but nobody noticed anything unusual or concerning. The Fisher home appeared quiet and normal from the outside, giving no indication of the horror that had occurred inside. At approximately 10 in the morning on April 10th, the accumulated natural gas in the Fisher home ignited. The explosion was massive, blowing out walls and causing the roof to collapse. The blast was heard throughout the neighbourhood and shook nearby homes. Neighbours rushed outside to see what had happened and saw the Fisher house engulfed in flames. The fire was intense, fed by the gas that continued to leak and the structural materials of the house. Multiple fire departments responded to the scene. Firefighters battled the blaze for hours. The explosion and fire had caused extensive damage to the house, making it dangerous for crews to enter and search for victims. It took considerable time to get the fire under control and begin the process of investigating what had happened. Initially, authorities thought they might be dealing with a tragic accident, perhaps a gas leak that had caused an explosion. But as investigators began examining the scene more carefully, they realised something was very wrong. When fire investigators and police were finally able to enter the burned remains of the house, they made a grim discovery. They found the bodies of Mary Fisher and the 2 children in an upstairs bedroom. Despite the fire damage, the medical examiner was able to determine that the victims had not died in the explosion or fire. Mary had been shot in the head, and the children had their throats cut. This was not an accident. This was murder, followed by an attempt to cover it up by destroying the house. Authorities immediately looked for Robert Fisher. They went to his workplace at the Mayo Clinic, but he had not shown up for work that day. They tried to contact him by phone, but got no answer. His truck was gone from the family home, and there was no sign of him anywhere. Police issued a be-on-the-lookout bulletin for Robert and for Mary's Toyota 4-wheel drive SUV that he had apparently taken. The vehicle was described in detail, and law enforcement across Arizona and neighbouring states were alerted to watch for it. The investigation into the murders and Robert's disappearance began in earnest. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, neighbours, and co-workers. They learned about the troubled marriage and Mary's plans to divorce Robert. They learned about Robert's statements that he would never let his family be broken up. They discovered that Robert had significant knowledge of wilderness survival and owned multiple weapons. They found that he had withdrawn cash from bank accounts in the days before the murders, suggesting he had been planning something. On April 14th, 4 days after the explosion, a man hiking in the Tonto National Forest, about 10 miles north of Scottsdale, made a discovery. He found Mary Fisher's Toyota 4-wheel drive vehicle abandoned in a remote area. The vehicle was at the end of a rough forest service road, parked in a location that required some skill to reach. When authorities arrived to process the vehicle, they found it had been wiped down in an apparent attempt to remove fingerprints. Inside the vehicle, they found dog hair and other evidence suggesting Blue, the family dog, had been in the SUV. But there was no sign of Robert Fisher or the dog. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle intensified the search for Robert Fisher. He had apparently driven to this remote location and then disappeared into the wilderness. The Tonto National Forest is vast, covering nearly 3 million acres of rugged mountain terrain. It includes steep canyons, dense vegetation, and areas that are extremely difficult to access. Robert was known to be an experienced outdoorsman who was familiar with this area. He had camped and hunted in these mountains many times and knew how to survive in the wilderness. Law enforcement launched a massive search operation. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and search teams on foot and horseback. They focused on the area around where the vehicle was found, searching caves, abandoned mine shafts, and remote camping areas. The search went on for days and then weeks. Despite the intensive effort and the resources devoted to finding Robert Fisher, searchers found no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into the wilderness. Some searchers believed Robert had committed suicide somewhere in the remote mountains, and that his body simply had not been found. The terrain was so rugged and the forest so vast that a body could easily be hidden or decompose in a ravine or cave without ever being discovered. Others believed Robert had hiked out of the forest and escaped, possibly with help from someone who picked him up at a predetermined location. The fact that the dog Blue was never found suggested to some investigators that Robert was still alive, as they believed he would not have killed his beloved dog. As the physical search in the Tonto National Forest eventually wound down without finding Robert, the investigation shifted to trying to track him through other means. Detectives looked at his financial records to see if he had accessed any accounts or used credit cards after the murders. They found no activity. They monitored known associates and family members to see if Robert tried to make contact. They checked border crossings into Mexico and Canada in case he had fled the country. They investigated tips and reported sightings that came in from across the country. Nothing led them to Robert Fisher. The FBI became involved in the case because of the possibility that Robert had fled across state lines, making it a federal matter. In June 2002, more than a year after the murders, the FBI added Robert William Fisher to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. This was a significant development that brought national attention to the case. Robert's photograph and description were distributed widely, and a reward was offered for information leading to his capture. The FBI wanted poster described Robert as armed and extremely dangerous, noting his outdoor survival skills and his history of violence. Robert William Fisher was described in the wanted posters as a white male, 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing around 190 pounds. He had brown hair and blue eyes. He would have been 40 years old when he disappeared in 2001. He had a surgical scar on his lower back from an injury years earlier. He was known to chew tobacco and had gold fillings in his teeth that might be identifiable by a dentist. He had no distinctive tattoos or other unusual physical features that would make him immediately recognizable, which complicated efforts to find him. Over the years since 2001, there have been numerous reported sightings of Robert Fisher. People have called in tips claiming to have seen him in various states and even in other countries. Some sightings seemed credible enough that investigators followed up on them, but none ever panned out. In some cases, the person who was spotted turned out to be someone else who vaguely resembled Robert. In other cases, the sighting could not be confirmed or the person could not be located. The passage of time has made positive identification increasingly difficult, as Robert would be significantly older now than he was in 2001. One theory that has persisted among some investigators is that Robert committed suicide in the wilderness shortly after abandoning the vehicle. Supporters of this theory point out that he had just murdered his entire family and destroyed his life. He may have planned from the beginning to kill himself after killing his family, and the abandoned vehicle in the remote forest location would be consistent with that plan. However, no body has ever been found despite extensive searches, and some investigators remain skeptical of the suicide theory. Another theory is that Robert successfully escaped and has been living under a new identity somewhere. This theory notes that Robert withdrew cash before the murders, suggesting he was planning ahead. He had survival skills that would have allowed him to hike out of the forest without being detected. If he had help from someone who picked him up at a prearranged location, he could have gotten far from Arizona before authorities even knew what he had done. Over the years, people claiming to be Robert Fisher, or people who resemble him, have been investigated, but none have proven to be the fugitive. A third theory suggests that Robert may have crossed the border into Mexico. Some investigators believe he could have made his way to Mexico and started a new life there, where it would be easier to avoid detection. Mexico in 2001 had less sophisticated law enforcement infrastructure and cooperation with US authorities than it does today, and someone with cash and determination could potentially disappear there. However, there has never been any confirmed sighting or evidence placing Robert Fisher in Mexico. The case has remained open and active for over 2 decades. The FBI kept Robert Fisher on the 10 most wanted list for years, though he was eventually removed from that list in 2021, 20 years after the murders. The removal from the 10 most wanted list did not mean the case was closed, or that authorities stopped looking for him. It simply meant the FBI needed to make room on the list for other fugitives, and felt that keeping Robert on the list was no longer generating useful leads. He remains a wanted fugitive, and there is still an active warrant for his arrest on charges of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution for murder and arson. The impact of Robert Fisher's crimes on the surviving family members has been devastating and long-lasting. Mary's family lost a beloved daughter, sister, and mother, as well as 2 grandchildren. They have had to live for over 20 years not knowing what happened to Robert Fisher, or whether he is alive or dead. The uncertainty has made it difficult to find closure. Some family members believe Robert is dead and that his body is somewhere in the Arizona wilderness where it will never be found. Others believe he is alive and living under a false identity, which fills them with anger that he has escaped justice. The Scottsdale community was shaken by the murders and the subsequent disappearance. The Fisher case became one of the most notorious crimes in Scottsdale history. The burned shell of the Fisher house stood for some time as a grim reminder of what had happened before it was eventually demolished. A new house was built on the property, but the location remained known to longtime residents as the site of the Fisher family murders. The case has been featured on numerous true crime television shows and podcasts over the years. America's Most Wanted covered the case multiple times. Various documentaries have examined the evidence and theories about what happened to Robert Fisher. Each time the case receives renewed media attention, tips come in from people who think they may have seen Robert, or who have theories about where he might be. Law enforcement follows up on credible leads, but so far nothing has resulted in finding Robert Fisher. Forensic analysis of the crime scene and the evidence recovered from the burned house provided investigators with a clear picture of what happened the night of the murders. The autopsy results showed that Mary had been shot while in bed, suggesting she may have been asleep when Robert killed her. The children had their throats cut, which indicated a more personal and brutal attack. The positioning of the bodies together in one room before the gas was released suggested Robert had arranged them deliberately, perhaps as some twisted form of keeping the family together in death. The investigation also revealed that Robert had been planning something in the days before the murders. He had made several purchases, including camping supplies, and he had withdrawn cash from ATM machines. Phone records showed he had made calls to family members in the days before the murders, calls that seemed normal at the time, but in hindsight appeared to be Robert perhaps saying goodbye without revealing his plans. Co-workers at the Mayo Clinic said Robert had seemed distracted and upset in the days before he disappeared, but nobody suspected he was planning mass murder. The question of what happened to Blue the dog has been a persistent mystery in the case. Robert was known to be very attached to Blue, and some investigators believe he would not have killed the dog. The absence of the dog's body or any trace of the dog suggests Robert may have taken Blue with him, either releasing the dog somewhere or keeping the dog with him wherever he went. If Robert did commit suicide in the wilderness, some believe Blue may have stayed with his body or wandered off and died elsewhere, explaining why the dog was never found. Over the years, advances in forensic technology have been applied to the Fisher case. DNA evidence from the crime scene was preserved and has been analysed using newer techniques. Investigators have also looked at whether digital forensics or cell phone tracking data that might not have been available or fully utilised in 2001 could provide new leads. So far, these efforts have not produced a breakthrough, but investigators remain hopeful that some piece of evidence or some new lead will eventually crack the case. The FBI and local law enforcement continue to receive tips about Robert Fisher's possible whereabouts. Some tips come from people who genuinely believe they have seen him. Others come from people who vaguely remember someone who might have resembled the wanted posters from years ago. A few tips have come from psychics, or people claiming to have special knowledge about what happened. Investigators have to evaluate each tip and decide which ones are worth pursuing with limited resources. In 2021, when the FBI removed Robert Fisher from the 10 most wanted list after 20 years, there was renewed media coverage of the case. The announcement led to a new round of tips and sightings being reported. Some people thought they had seen Robert Fisher working at various jobs around the country. Others claimed to have encountered someone matching his description in places as far away as Canada or Central America. None of these leads resulted in locating Robert Fisher, but the publicity did serve to remind the public that he remains a wanted fugitive. The reward money for information leading to Robert Fisher's capture has been increased multiple times over the years. The current reward stands at $100,000. A substantial amount that authorities hope will motivate someone with information to come forward. The reward is offered for information that leads directly to Robert Fisher's arrest, meaning that vague tips or unconfirmed sightings would not qualify. Someone would need to provide information specific enough that authorities could actually locate and apprehend Robert. Some forensic psychologists and criminal profilers who have studied the Fisher case believe that Robert's personality type and the circumstances of his crimes make it more likely that he committed suicide shortly after the murders. They point to the fact that he had just destroyed his entire family and his own life. He was facing the certainty of being caught and spending the rest of his life in prison. The shame and guilt combined with his religious beliefs might have led him to take his own life. However, others argue that someone willing to murder his family might also be willing to do whatever it takes to survive and avoid capture. The Fisher case has become a subject of study for those interested in family annihilation cases. Robert Fisher fits the profile of many family annihilators in some ways. He was facing a crisis, the end of his marriage, that threatened his identity and his vision of his life. He was controlling and could not accept losing his family through divorce. Rather than let his family leave him, he chose to kill them. However, unlike most family annihilators, who either commit suicide at the scene or wait to be arrested, Robert apparently attempted to escape, making his case somewhat unusual. Mary Fisher's family has spoken publicly about the case over the years, particularly around anniversaries of the murders. They have pleaded for anyone with information about Robert Fisher's whereabouts to come forward. They have expressed their ongoing grief over losing Mary, Brittany, and Bobby. They have described Mary as a loving mother who was trying to do what was best for herself and her children by leaving an unhealthy marriage. They have described Brittany as a bright 13-year-old girl on the verge of becoming a young woman, and Bobby as a sweet 10-year-old boy who loved sports and animals. The family wants justice and closure, and as long as Robert Fisher remains at large, they cannot fully have either. The Scottsdale Police Department maintains an active case file on the Fisher murders and continues to investigate any credible leads that come in. Detectives who work the case now were not even on the force when the murders occurred, but they have studied the case files extensively and remain committed to finding Robert Fisher, if he is alive, or confirming his death if he committed suicide. The passage of time has not diminished law enforcement's determination to resolve this case. If Robert Fisher is still alive today, he would be in his early 60s. His appearance would have changed significantly from the photographs taken in his late 30s and early 40s that appear on wanted posters. He would likely have grey hair, more wrinkles, and would have aged in ways that might make him harder to recognise. However, his surgical scar and dental work would still be identifiable if he were captured. Some investigators believe that if Robert is alive, he has undergone some kind of transformation, perhaps growing a beard, gaining or losing significant weight, or otherwise changing his appearance to avoid recognition. The possibility that Robert Fisher has been living under an assumed identity for over 20 years raises questions about how he would have obtained false identification and established a new life without being detected. In the early 2000s, it was somewhat easier to create a false identity than it is today, with modern database systems and identification verification technology. If Robert obtained false documents in the early days after his disappearance, he might have been able to use those documents to get a job, rent housing, and live relatively normally under an assumed name. Some people who have followed the case closely believe Robert Fisher could not have survived in the wilderness indefinitely and must have either died there or found a way to escape and start a new life. The Tonto National Forest is a harsh environment, especially in the summer months when temperatures can exceed 100 degrees. Even an experienced outdoorsman like Robert would have struggled to survive for an extended period without supplies. This has led many to conclude that if Robert did not commit suicide, he must have left the forest relatively quickly and gotten help from someone, or made his way to a location where he could blend in. Robert William Fisher remains one of the most wanted fugitives in Arizona history. The murders of Mary Fisher, Brittany Fisher, and Bobby Fisher remain officially unsolved as long as Robert has not been captured or confirmed dead. The case serves as a tragic reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to the worst possible outcome. Mary Fisher was trying to leave an unhappy marriage, a decision that should have been her right to make without fear. Instead, her husband apparently chose to murder her and their children rather than let the family separate. The three victims of Robert Fisher's violence never got to live the lives they should have had. Mary was 38 years old, a teacher who had years of career ahead of her and the life she was planning to rebuild after divorce. Brittany was 13, a teenager who should have experienced high school, college, and adulthood. Bobby was 10, a boy who should have grown up and had his own family someday. All three were killed for no reason other than one man's inability to accept that his marriage was ending and his family was changing. Their deaths serve as a stark example of the ultimate form of controlling behaviour in domestic violence situations. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 6. Case number 6. Jeffrey McDonald was a captain in the United States Army, serving as a physician at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He was 26 years old in February 1970, married to his wife Colette, who was 26 and pregnant with their third child. They had 2 daughters, Kimberly, who was 5 years old, and Kristen, who was 2. The family lived in military housing on the base at 544 Castle Drive, a modest but comfortable apartment that was home to what appeared from the outside to be a happy young military family. Jeffrey had grown up in Long Island, New York, and had been a successful student and athlete in high school. He attended Princeton University and then Northwestern University Medical School, where he had been near the top of his class. He had married Colette while still in college, and she had worked to help support them through his medical training. After completing his residency, Jeffrey had joined the army to fulfill his military service obligation. By all accounts, he was ambitious, charming, and had a bright future ahead of him as a physician. Colette McDonald came from a military family. Her father was a career military officer, and she had grown up moving between different bases. She had met Jeffrey when she was young, and they had married when she was still a teenager. She had put her own education on hold to work and support Jeffrey through medical school. By 1970, she was taking college courses while also caring for their 2 daughters and preparing for the arrival of their third child. Friends described her as devoted to her family and proud of her husband's accomplishments. On the evening of February 16, 1970, the McDonald family had what appeared to be a normal night. Jeffrey later said he had stayed up late watching television after Colette and the girls went to bed. He said he fell asleep on the living room couch while watching the Johnny Carson show. According to his account, he was awakened in the early morning hours of February 17th by screaming. What happened next would become the subject of one of the most controversial and heavily debated murder cases in American history. At approximately 3:40 in the morning on February 17th, military police received a call from Jeffrey MacDonald. He told the dispatcher that his family had been attacked and needed help immediately. When military police and medics arrived at 544 Castle Drive just minutes later, they found a scene of horrific violence. Colette MacDonald was lying on the floor of the master bedroom, dead from multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma to her head. She had been stabbed 37 times with both a knife and an ice pick. Her skull had been fractured. In the smaller bedroom next to the master bedroom, 5-year-old Kimberly was lying in her bed, also dead from multiple stab wounds. She had been stabbed in the neck and chest. In another bedroom down the hall, 2-year-old Kristen was found dead in her bed. She had been stabbed 33 times. The violence inflicted on the 2 small children was brutal and excessive. Blood was found throughout the apartment, on the walls, floors, and furniture. Jeffrey MacDonald was found in the master bedroom near his wife's body. He had injuries, but they were relatively minor compared to the carnage around him. He had a small stab wound on his chest that had punctured his lung but was not life-threatening. He had some cuts and bruises. He was conscious and able to talk to the medics and military police. He immediately began telling them what he said had happened. According to Jeffrey's account, he had been sleeping on the couch in the living room when he was awakened by screaming. He said he saw 4 intruders in his apartment. He described them as 3 men and 1 woman. One of the men was black and the others were white. The woman had long blonde hair and was wearing a floppy hat and holding a candle. Jeffrey said the intruders were chanting something that sounded like, "Acid is groovy," and "Kill the pigs." He said they attacked him and he tried to fight them off but was overpowered. Jeffrey told investigators that during the struggle, one of the intruders hit him with what he thought might have been a baseball bat or a piece of wood. He said they stabbed him and he lost consciousness. When he woke up, the intruders were gone. He said he went to check on his family and found his wife and daughters had been attacked. He said he tried to help them, checking for breathing and attempting CPR on his wife. He called for help and then passed out again before the military police arrived. The crime scene investigators who processed the apartment found numerous problems with Jeffrey's story. The living room where Jeffrey said he had fought with the intruders showed very little signs of a struggle. A coffee table was on its side, but items on the table had fallen in a way that suggested the table had been gently tipped over, rather than knocked over in a violent struggle. Jeffrey's pajama top was found on Colette's body in the bedroom, torn and with numerous ice pick holes through it. This seemed inconsistent with Jeffrey's story that the intruders had attacked him in the living room. The investigators also noticed that the word pig was written in blood on the headboard of the bed in the master bedroom. This immediately reminded investigators of the recent Manson family murders in California, where similar words had been written in blood at the crime scenes. The Manson murders had been heavily covered in the news just months earlier, and the similarities seemed suspicious. The use of the phrase "acid is groovy" in Jeffrey's account also echoed the drug culture associations of the Manson case. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed more inconsistencies. The blood evidence showed that Colette had been attacked in the master bedroom and had not moved from that location. Blood from Colette was found on Kimberly, suggesting that whoever killed Kimberly had already attacked Colette and had her blood on them or on a weapon when they went to Kimberly's room. But no blood from Kimberly was found on Colette, which was inconsistent with Jeffrey's claim that he had moved between the rooms trying to help his family members. The pajama top that was found on Colette's body had 48 ice pick holes in it. When investigators folded the pajama top in certain ways, the holes lined up, suggesting the top had been folded or bunched up when it was stabbed. This did not match Jeffrey's story that he was wearing the pajama top when the intruders attacked him. It appeared more consistent with the pajama top being used as a shield or being placed over something when it was stabbed. Investigators theorized that Jeffrey might have used the pajama top to try to protect himself from Colette or to bundle weapons after the attacks. The military investigation initially focused on Jeffrey as a suspect, but he maintained his innocence. He insisted that intruders had killed his family and that he was a victim who had tried to fight them off. He provided detailed descriptions of the 4 intruders to investigators and helped create composite sketches. He said the woman with blonde hair had said the phrase, "acid is groovy," and he believed the intruders might have been hippies or people on drugs based on their appearance and behaviour. In the weeks following the murders, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division conducted an extensive investigation. They interviewed Jeffrey repeatedly, and his story remained largely consistent, though some details changed in small ways across different tellings. They searched for evidence of the intruders Jeffrey described, but found nothing to corroborate his account. No fingerprints from unknown persons were found in the apartment. No physical evidence placed anyone else at the scene besides Jeffrey and his family. The Army convened an Article 32 hearing, which is similar to a grand jury proceeding in civilian courts. The hearing was held to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to charge Jeffrey MacDonald with the murders of his wife and children. The hearing lasted from July to September 1970. Prosecutors presented evidence that they believed showed Jeffrey had killed his family and staged the crime scene to look like intruders had done it. The defence argued that the investigation had been flawed and that the evidence against Jeffrey was circumstantial. One witness who testified at the Article 32 hearing was a woman named Helena Stokely. She was a local woman known to use drugs and associate with a rough crowd. She had blonde hair and admitted that on the night of the murders, she could not remember where she had been. She said she might have been at the MacDonald apartment, but she was not sure because she had been heavily using drugs during that time period. Her testimony was confusing and contradictory, but some people saw it as potential support for Jeffrey's story about intruders. At the conclusion of the Article 32 hearing, the presiding officer recommended that all charges against Jeffrey MacDonald be dismissed. He found that the evidence was not sufficient to prove Jeffrey had committed the murders. The Army agreed and dismissed the charges in October 1970. Jeffrey was allowed to leave the Army and return to civilian life. He moved to California, where he resumed his medical career, working as an emergency room physician. Many people believed the case was closed and that Jeffrey had been cleared of any wrongdoing. But Colette's family, particularly her stepfather Freddie Kassab, was not satisfied. Freddie had initially supported Jeffrey and believed his story about intruders. But as time passed and Freddie learned more about the evidence from the crime scene, he became convinced that Jeffrey had murdered Colette and the children. Freddie launched his own investigation and began pressuring authorities to reopen the case. He contacted the Department of Justice and urged them to take another look at the evidence. In 1974, a federal grand jury was convened to review the MacDonald case. The grand jury heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and witnesses. They reviewed the physical evidence from the crime scene and examined the inconsistencies in Jeffrey's story. In January 1975, the grand jury returned an indictment charging Jeffrey MacDonald with 3 counts of murder. Jeffrey was arrested in California and brought back to North Carolina to face trial. Jeffrey's trial did not begin until 1979, nearly 9 years after the murders. The delay was due to various legal challenges and appeal. Jeffrey's defense team argued that the lengthy delay violated his right to a speedy trial. They also argued that trying him again after the Army had dismissed charges constituted double jeopardy. Courts rejected these arguments, ruling that the military proceeding had not been a full trial and that federal jurisdiction allowed the new prosecution. The trial began in July 1979 and lasted for 6 weeks. The prosecution presented a detailed case built on forensic evidence and the inconsistencies in Jeffrey's story. They brought in experts who testified about the blood evidence, the lack of signs of a struggle in the living room, and the pajama top with the ice pick holes. They argued that the crime scene had been staged to look like intruders had committed the murders, when in fact, Jeffrey had killed his family. The prosecution's theory of what actually happened that night was based on the physical evidence. They believed that an argument had started between Jeffrey and Colette, possibly in the master bedroom. During the argument, Jeffrey had struck Colette with something, possibly a piece of wood or another object, fracturing her skull. Kimberly may have woken up and come into the room, and Jeffrey may have struck her as well. He then went to get weapons from the kitchen, including knives and an ice pick, and stabbed Colette multiple times. The prosecution theorized that Jeffrey then went to Kimberly's room and stabbed her to eliminate a witness. He then went to Kristen's room and stabbed her as well. After killing his family, Jeffrey staged the crime scene to make it look like intruders had done it. He tipped over the coffee table, knocked over a few items, and used his pajama top in some way that resulted in it having multiple ice pick holes. He then inflicted relatively minor injuries on himself, including the punctured lung, to support his story that he had been attacked. The motive for the murders, according to prosecutors, may have been related to stress in the MacDonald marriage. Jeffrey was described as someone who was very concerned with his image and success. He was ambitious and wanted to be seen as a perfect husband, father, and physician. But testimony revealed that the marriage had some problems. Colette was pregnant again when they had not necessarily been planning another child. Jeffrey had been working long hours and may have been having an affair. Some witnesses suggested Jeffrey had been using diet pills that could have affected his mood and behaviour. The defence argued that Jeffrey was innocent and that his story about intruders was true. They pointed to Helena Stokely as evidence that there may have been intruders matching Jeffrey's description in the area that night. They challenged the prosecution's forensic evidence, bringing in their own experts who offered alternative interpretations. They argued that the Army's investigation had been incompetent and had contaminated the crime scene, making it impossible to know what evidence might have been lost or compromised. The defence also tried to paint Jeffrey as a loving husband and father who had no reason to kill his family. They called witnesses who testified about Jeffrey's devotion to Colette and the children. They emphasised that Jeffrey had no history of violence and had been a successful physician and officer. They argued that the prosecution's case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence and that there was reasonable doubt about Jeffrey's guilt. Helena Stokely was called as a witness by the defence, but her testimony did not help Jeffrey's case. She testified that she had been using drugs heavily in early 1970 and could not remember where she had been on the night of the murders. She said she had vague memories that might have been from that night, but could not say for certain. She described having dreams or flashbacks of being in a room with candles and violence, but she could not confirm these were real memories versus drug-induced hallucinations. Her testimony was too vague and uncertain to provide any real support for Jeffrey's claims. The trial included detailed and disturbing testimony about the injuries suffered by Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. The medical examiner described each wound and explained the sequence in which the attacks likely occurred. The jury saw graphic crime scene photographs showing the bodies and the blood throughout the apartment. The brutality of the murders, particularly the excessive stabbing of the two small children, was difficult for everyone in the courtroom to hear about. On August 29, 1979, after deliberating for 6.5 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of murder. They convicted Jeffrey MacDonald of second-degree murder in the death of Colette and first-degree murder in the deaths of Kimberly and Kristen. The distinction suggested the jury believed the murders of the children had been premeditated, while Colette's death may have resulted from an altercation that got out of control. Jeffrey showed little emotion as the verdicts were read. The judge sentenced Jeffrey to 3 consecutive life sentences. He was sent to federal prison to begin serving his sentence. Jeffrey immediately began the appeals process, arguing that he had not received a fair trial and that the evidence did not support his conviction. Over the following decades, Jeffrey filed numerous appeals and motions for a new trial. Most of these appeals were denied, though some resulted in temporary releases from prison while legal issues were being resolved. One of Jeffrey's arguments on appeal was that the prosecution had withheld evidence that might have supported his defence. Years after the trial, it was revealed that Helena Stokely had made statements to others, saying she had been at the MacDonald apartment the night of the murders. Some people who knew her said she had confessed to being involved or present during the attacks. The defence argued this was exculpatory evidence that should have been provided to them before trial. Courts generally rejected these arguments, finding that Helena Stokely's statements were unreliable and that she had also told people she was not at the apartment and did not know anything about the murders. Her drug use and mental health problems made her an unreliable witness, and judges found that her later statements did not constitute clear evidence of Jeffrey's innocence. The fact that she had testified at trial and had been unable to confirm being at the apartment also undermined claims that her statements were newly discovered evidence. Over the years, new forensic techniques and DNA testing became available. Jeffrey's defence team sought to have evidence from the crime scene retested using modern methods. Some testing was allowed, and results were analysed by both prosecution and defence experts. The defence argued that some test results showed DNA from unknown persons at the crime scene, supporting the intruder theory. The prosecution argued that any unknown DNA could be explained by contamination, or by people who had legitimate access to the apartment before or after the murders. In 2012, Jeffrey MacDonald filed a motion for a new trial, based on DNA evidence and other claims. The motion was heard by a federal judge who conducted an evidentiary hearing lasting several weeks. Both sides presented expert testimony about the DNA evidence and other forensic issues. In 2014, the judge denied the motion for a new trial, finding that the new evidence did not undermine confidence in the guilty verdicts. The judge found that the DNA evidence was inconclusive and that the other arguments raised by the defense had been addressed in previous proceedings. Jeffrey has continued to maintain his innocence throughout his decades in prison. He has given numerous interviews over the years, always insisting that intruders killed his family and that he has been wrongly convicted. He has written letters and communicated with supporters who believe in his innocence. There is a group of people, including some forensic experts and legal professionals, who believe Jeffrey was wrongly convicted and that the evidence supports his story about intruders. But most people who have studied the case, including law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and many forensic experts, believe the evidence clearly shows Jeffrey killed his family. They point to the physical evidence that contradicts his story, the lack of any evidence supporting the intruder theory, and the implausibility of his account. The idea that 4 intruders would break into a military apartment, kill 3 people, but leave Jeffrey with only minor injuries and leave behind no physical evidence seems far-fetched to most investigators. Colette's family has remained convinced of Jeffrey's guilt. Her stepfather, Freddie Kassab, devoted years of his life to ensuring Jeffrey was prosecuted. Freddie died in 1994, but other family members have continued to oppose Jeffrey's release and have attended parole hearings to argue against his freedom. They have stated publicly that they believe justice was served when Jeffrey was convicted and that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television programs. Joe McGinnis wrote a book called Fatal Vision that was published in 1983 and became a bestseller. The book presented the case for Jeffrey's guilt and was based on extensive interviews with Jeffrey and access to case files. McGinnis had initially been hired by Jeffrey's defense team to write a sympathetic book, but after reviewing the evidence, McGinnis became convinced of Jeffrey's guilt. When the book was published, Jeffrey sued McGinnis for fraud and breach of contract, claiming McGinnis had deceived him about his intentions. The lawsuit between Jeffrey and McGinnis was eventually settled out of court, but it raised interesting questions about journalistic ethics and the relationship between writers and their subjects. Other authors have written books taking different perspectives on the case, some arguing for Jeffrey's innocence and others supporting his conviction. The case has remained in the public consciousness for decades, partly because of these books and media coverage, and partly because of the ongoing legal battles Jeffrey has waged. In recent years, Jeffrey has been incarcerated at a federal prison in Maryland. He is now over 80 years old and has been in prison for more than 40 years. He has continued to file legal motions and appeals, though his options for relief have become increasingly limited. He has applied for parole and been denied. He has sought compassionate release based on his age and health issues and been denied. Courts have consistently found that he poses a danger to society and that his release is not warranted. The question of what really happened in the early morning hours of February 17, 1970, may never be definitively answered to everyone's satisfaction. Those who believe in Jeffrey's innocence point to Helena Stokely's statements, questions about the adequacy of the original investigation, and their interpretation of the forensic evidence as creating reasonable doubt. Those who believe in his guilt point to the overwhelming physical evidence that contradicts his story, the lack of any credible evidence of intruders, and the implausibility of his account. What is certain is that 3 innocent people died that night. Colette McDonald was 26 years old and pregnant. She was killed in her own home, murdered with shocking brutality. 5-year-old Kimberly was sleeping in her bed when she was stabbed to death. 2-year-old Kristen was also murdered in her bed. 3 lives were destroyed, and the pain and trauma extended to the extended family members who lost loved ones and have had to live with this tragedy for over 50 years. The McDonald case stands as one of the most controversial murder cases in American history. The lengthy delay between the murders and the trial, the questions about the military investigation, the ambiguous evidence from witnesses like Helena Stokely, and the complexity of the forensic evidence have all contributed to ongoing debate about the case. Legal scholars have studied the case for insights into issues like double jeopardy, speedy trial rights, and the admissibility of new evidence in old cases. For those who knew Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen, the debates and legal proceedings have been a painful reminder of their loss. Colette was described by those who knew her as kind, devoted to her family, and excited about the future. She was working on her college degree while raising 2 children and preparing for a third. Kimberly was starting school and developing her own personality. Kristen was a toddler, experiencing the world with wonder. All 3 deserved to live long lives, and instead they were killed in a senseless act of violence. The impact of the case extended beyond the immediate family. The military community at Fort Bragg was shaken by the murders. The idea that a physician and officer could be accused of killing his own family was difficult for many to accept. Some people in the military community supported Jeffrey and believed he was being scapegoated by an investigation that had failed to find the real killers. Others believed the evidence clearly pointed to Jeffrey's guilt and felt betrayed that someone they had trusted could commit such horrific acts. Jeffrey MacDonald remains in federal custody, serving 3 life sentences for the murders of his wife and daughters. Unless his conviction is overturned on appeal or he is granted clemency, which seems extremely unlikely at this point, he will die in prison. He has spent far more of his life incarcerated than he spent as a free man. The promising medical career he had at age 26 never materialized. Instead, he became one of the most notorious convicted murderers in American history, forever associated with the deaths of his family on that February night in 1970. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 7. Case number 7. Jean-Claude Ramond appeared to be living an impressive life in the early 1990s. He told everyone he was a successful doctor working as a researcher for the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. He lived with his wife Florence and their 2 children in a comfortable house in Ferney-Voltaire, a French town near the Swiss border. To his family, friends and neighbours, Jean-Claude seemed to have achieved exactly what he had set out to do. He had a prestigious career, a beautiful family and financial stability. But every single detail of his professional life was a complete fabrication. Jean-Claude Ramond had grown up in the Jura region of eastern France. His parents, Amy and Anne-Marie, were hard-working people who ran a small forestry business. They were modest, decent people who valued education and wanted their son to succeed. Jean-Claude was a good student in his youth, quiet and studious. He did well enough in school to gain admission to medical school in Lyon in the early 1970s. This was a source of great pride for his parents, who saw their son on the path to becoming a doctor. Jean-Claude attended medical school at the University of Lyon and completed his coursework successfully for the first 2 years. But in his second year, he was supposed to take an important exam that would allow him to continue in the medical program. For reasons that Jean-Claude never fully explained, he did not show up for this exam. He simply did not take it. This one decision set in motion a lie that would consume the next 18 years of his life and ultimately end in the murder of his entire family. After failing to take the exam, Jean-Claude should have told his family and friends that he had not passed and would need to either retake it or reconsider his career plans. Instead, he told everyone he had passed. He continued to go through the motions of being a medical student. He would leave home as if going to classes and spend his days in libraries or just wandering around. He maintained the pretense that everything was fine and that he was progressing normally through medical school. When the time came for graduation, Jean-Claude told his family he had completed medical school and received his degree. He showed them what appeared to be a diploma, though it was fake. He told them he was going to pursue further training and research rather than practicing as a general physician. His parents were proud and had no reason to doubt him. Jean-Claude was their son, and he had always been responsible and honest as far as they knew. The idea that he would lie about something so fundamental never crossed their minds. Jean-Claude met Florence Collet while maintaining his facade as a medical student. Florence came from a well-off family. Her father, Bernard Collet, was a successful doctor, which made the lie even more elaborate because Jean-Claude had to maintain the pretense of being a medical professional around people who actually worked in medicine. Florence fell in love with Jean-Claude and believed completely in the life he described. They married in 1980, and Florence had no idea that her husband had never actually completed medical school or earned a medical degree. After getting married, Jean-Claude told Florence and both families that he had gotten a position as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. This was a prestigious job that would explain why he needed to travel to Switzerland regularly, and why he sometimes seemed busy with important work. In reality, Jean-Claude had no job at all. He had never worked for WHO. He had no income from employment. Every day he would leave his house in the morning as if going to work, drive to Switzerland, and spend the day doing absolutely nothing productive. Jean-Claude would spend his days in Geneva, sitting in cafes, walking around, or sitting in his car. He would go to the WHO building and walk around the public areas so he could describe the building accurately to Florence and others. He would buy WHO publications that were available to the public so he could talk knowledgeably about WHO projects and initiatives. He became skilled at faking his way through conversations about international health issues by reading extensively and memorizing details that would make him sound credible. The question of how Jean-Claude supported himself and his family financially, while having no actual job, is central to understanding his deception. He was essentially running a long-term con, borrowing money from family members and friends under various pretenses. He would tell his parents he needed money for investments or to help colleagues. He would tell friends he had investment opportunities that required capital. He would borrow from Florence's family by claiming he needed money for important projects. He was constantly cycling money between different sources, paying back one loan with money borrowed from another person. Jean-Claude also engaged in outright theft and fraud. He stole checkbooks from friends and family members and forged checks. He created fake documents showing investments and bank accounts that did not exist. When Florence or others asked to see proof of their finances, Jean-Claude would show them carefully constructed forgery. He maintained multiple bank accounts, most of which were empty or overdrawn, and he became skilled at manipulating which account information he showed to which person to maintain the illusion of wealth. Florence and Jean-Claude had 2 children during their marriage. Antoine was born in 1985, and Caroline was born in 1987. Jean-Claude appeared to be a devoted father. He spent time with his children, helped with their homework, and participated in family activities. The children believed their father was an important doctor who worked for a major international organisation. They had no reason to think anything was wrong. Their life seemed normal and comfortable. But by the early 1990s, Jean-Claude's web of lies was becoming impossible to maintain. He had borrowed money from so many people that he could no longer keep track of who he owed and how much. His fake investments and financial schemes were being questioned by people who wanted to see returns or withdraw their money. Florence's father, Bernard, was becoming suspicious about some of the financial dealings Jean-Claude had described. Bernard was a real doctor with a real career, and he was starting to notice inconsistencies in Jean-Claude's stories about his work at WHO. In late 1992 and early 1993, the pressure on Jean-Claude was mounting. People were demanding their money back. Bernard Crollet was asking more pointed questions about Jean-Claude's job and finances. Florence was beginning to sense something was wrong, though she probably could not have imagined the full scope of her husband's deception. Jean-Claude was facing the imminent collapse of the entire false life he had constructed over nearly 2 decades. Rather than confess and face the consequences, he began planning something horrific. On the evening of January 9th, 1993, Jean-Claude made his decision. He took a rifle that he owned and went upstairs in the family home in Ferney-Voltaire. He went to the bedroom where his 5-year-old daughter Caroline was sleeping. He shot her in the head while she slept, killing her instantly. He then went to the bedroom where his 7-year-old son Antoine was sleeping. He shot Antoine in the head as well, killing him. The children died without knowing what was happening, murdered by their father as they slept in their own beds. After killing his children, Jean-Claude went back downstairs where his wife Florence was. What exactly happened next has been the subject of some dispute, because Jean-Claude gave conflicting accounts. What is certain is that Jean-Claude killed Florence as well. He shot her multiple times. She may have realised what was happening in the moments before her death, though the exact sequence of events is unclear. Jean-Claude then took a canister of gasoline and poured it throughout the house, preparing to set it on fire. But Jean-Claude did not set the fire immediately. Instead, he got in his car and drove to his parents' house in the Jura region, several hours away. His parents, Aime and Anne-Marie, were elderly and living quietly in the home where Jean-Claude had grown up. They had no idea that their son had just murdered his wife and children. When Jean-Claude arrived at his parents' house on the morning of January 10th, they welcomed him as they always did. Jean-Claude spent some time with his parents, talking with them about ordinary things. Then, when the moment came, he attacked them. He killed his father Aime, who was in his late 60s, by beating him and shooting him. He killed his mother Anne-Marie the same way. The violence he used against his elderly parents was brutal and sustained. After murdering them, Jean-Claude set fire to their house, hoping to destroy the evidence of what he had done. Jean-Claude then drove back toward his own house in Ferney-Voltaire. Along the way, he stopped and wrote letters to various people. In these letters, he tried to explain his actions, though his explanations were incoherent and self-serving. He seemed to be attempting to create a narrative where he was somehow a victim of circumstances, rather than a man who had chosen to murder 5 people. He mailed some of these letters and left others in his car. When Jean-Claude returned to his house where the bodies of his wife and children lay, he finally set the fire he had prepared the night before. He poured more gasoline around and lit it, starting a blaze that quickly engulfed the house. But instead of leaving, Jean-Claude stayed inside. He took a large quantity of barbiturates, sleeping pills, that he intended to use to kill himself. He wanted to die in the fire with his family, apparently believing this would somehow be a fitting end to his life of deception. The fire at the Romand house was reported by neighbours, and firefighters responded quickly. They found the house burning and went inside to search for victims. They discovered the bodies of Florence, Antoine, and Caroline. They also found Jean-Claude, unconscious from the drugs but still alive. The firefighters pulled him from the burning house, and he was taken to a hospital. He had suffered smoke inhalation and burns, but he survived. When police investigated the fire and the deaths, they initially thought they were dealing with a tragic accident, or perhaps a murder-suicide, where Jean-Claude had killed his family and then tried to kill himself. But as they began looking into Jean-Claude's background, the full scope of his deception started to emerge. They discovered he did not work for WHO. They found evidence of his financial frauds and the loans he had taken from numerous people. They learned about the fake medical degree and the 18 years of lies. The investigation then connected Jean-Claude to the deaths of his parents. When authorities went to Amy and Anne-Marie's house in the Jura, they found it had also been burned. Inside the burned remains, they discovered the bodies of Jean-Claude's parents. They had been murdered before the fire was set. Investigators realised that Jean-Claude had killed his entire family, not just his wife and children, but his parents as well. 5 people were dead, all killed by Jean-Claude Romand within a 24-hour period. Jean-Claude was arrested at the hospital as soon as he was medically stable enough to be taken into custody. He was charged with 5 counts of murder and arson. As he recovered from his suicide attempt, he began giving statements to police. His explanations for why he had killed his family were rambling and often contradictory. He claimed he had killed them to spare them the shame of learning about his lies. He said he could not bear the thought of them finding out he had been deceiving them for 18 years. He presented himself as someone who had been trapped by his own deception and saw murder as the only way out. The investigation into Jean-Claude's life revealed the staggering extent of his fraud. Detectives pieced together that for 18 years, Jean-Claude had never held a job. Every single day, he had engaged in an elaborate performance of going to work when he was actually doing nothing. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of francs from family and friends through loans he never intended to repay and outright fraud. He had created an entirely fictitious professional identity that he had maintained with meticulous attention to detail. People who had known Jean-Claude were stunned when the truth came out. His friends could not believe that the man they had known for years had never actually been a doctor or a WHO researcher. Florence's family was devastated, not only by her murder and the murders of the children, but by the revelation that everything Jean-Claude had told them for over a decade had been a lie. The people from whom Jean-Claude had borrowed money realised they had been victims of a long-running con and that their money was gone. Jean-Claude's trial began in June 1996. More than 3 years after the murders. The trial was held in Bourg-en-Bresse, a town in eastern France. The proceedings attracted massive media attention. The case had all the elements that fascinated the public. A man living a double life, an elaborate long-term deception, and a family annihilation that seemed almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. Journalists filled the courtroom, and the trial was covered extensively in French newspapers and television. The prosecution presented the case as premeditated murder. They argued that Jean-Claude had killed his family to prevent them from discovering his lies. They showed that he had killed methodically, starting with the children who were most vulnerable, then his wife, then his parents. They emphasized that he had set fires to try to cover up the murders and destroy evidence. They argued that his suicide attempt was not genuine remorse, but rather an attempt to escape responsibility for what he had done. The defense faced an almost impossible task. Jean-Claude had confessed to the murders, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The defense strategy was to argue that Jean-Claude had been suffering from severe psychological problems that had driven him to commit these acts. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that Jean-Claude had a personality disorder, and that his years of lying had created a psychological state where he felt he had no choice but to kill his family. The defense argued that Jean-Claude was not a cold-blooded killer, but rather someone who had become so trapped in his web of lies that he had experienced a psychological break. They claimed he genuinely believed he was protecting his family from shame by killing them before they could learn the truth. They emphasized that Jean-Claude had no history of violence before this, and that the murders were the result of an extreme psychological crisis, rather than inherent evil. Psychiatrists who examined Jean-Claude disagreed about his mental state. Some concluded he had significant psychological problems, including narcissistic personality traits and an inability to face reality. Others felt he was calculating and manipulative, someone who had chosen to maintain his lies rather than admit the truth, and who had then chosen murder rather than confession. The question of whether Jean-Claude was mentally ill in a way that diminished his responsibility for the murders became a central issue in the trial. Jean-Claude himself testified at the trial. He appeared in court and answered questions from prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the judge. His testimony was strange and unsettling. He spoke in a flat, emotionless tone about killing his family. He tried to explain his reasoning, but his explanations made little sense. He claimed he had loved his family and had killed them to protect them, which was obviously contradictory. He seemed unable or unwilling to take full responsibility for his actions, instead presenting himself as someone who had been victimized by circumstances. The families of the victims attended the trial and gave testimony about the impact of Jean-Claude's crimes. Florence's family described the horror of learning that their daughter and grandchildren had been murdered by the man they had welcomed into their family. They talked about how Florence had been a loving mother and wife, and how the children had been innocent victims who never got to grow up. They expressed anger at Jean-Claude, not just for the murders, but for the years of deception that had led up to them. The trial included detailed testimony about the murders themselves. The medical examiner described the injuries that had killed each victim. Antoine and Caroline had been shot in the head at close range while they slept. Florence had been shot multiple times. Aimée and Anne-Marie had been beaten and shot. The level of violence Jean-Claude had used against his own parents was particularly disturbing, suggesting rage beyond what would be necessary to simply end their lives. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching a verdict. They found Jean-Claude Ramond guilty on all counts of murder. The conviction meant he would face a significant prison sentence. Under French law at the time, the maximum sentence for murder was life in prison, with a minimum period that must be served before parole could be considered. The question was how long Jean-Claude's minimum period would be before he could be eligible for parole. The judge sentenced Jean-Claude to life in prison. The sentence included a provision that he would not be eligible to apply for parole until he had served at least 22 years. This was a harsh sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes and the fact that he had killed 5 members of his own family. Jean-Claude showed little reaction as the sentence was announced. He was taken from the courtroom to begin serving his sentence in the French prison system. The case of Jean-Claude Ramond became one of the most famous criminal cases in France. It was studied by psychologists and criminologists trying to understand what drives someone to maintain such an elaborate deception for so long, and then to commit mass murder rather than admit the truth. Books were written about the case, including one by the French writer Emmanuel Carrère called The Adversary, that explored Jean-Claude's psychology and the events leading up to the murders. The question of why Jean-Claude maintained his deception for 18 years, rather than simply admitting he had failed to complete medical school, has been debated extensively. Some psychologists believe he suffered from a personality disorder that made him incapable of facing failure or disappointing others. Others think he was a pathological liar who found lying easier than dealing with reality. Some argue he was trapped by the initial lie and felt he had gone too far to ever come clean without destroying his life. What made Jean-Claude's deception possible was his intelligence and attention to detail. He was smart enough to learn about WHO and international health issues, so he could talk convincingly about his supposed work. He was organised enough to maintain multiple fake identities and financial schemes without getting caught for years. He was a skilled manipulator who knew how to present himself as trustworthy and successful. These same qualities that allowed him to deceive people for so long also made him capable of planning and executing the murders of his family. The impact of Jean-Claude's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The friends and family members who had lent him money felt betrayed and foolish for having trusted him. The community in Ferney-Voltaire, where the Romans had lived, was shocked that such violence could occur in their quiet town. People who had known Jean-Claude questioned how they could have been so completely deceived by someone they thought they knew well. The case made people question their ability to truly know another person. Jean-Claude served his prison sentence at various facilities in France. Reports from the prison system indicated he was a model prisoner who caused no problems and participated in available programs. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and researchers over the years, though he never provided a fully satisfactory explanation for his actions. He expressed what seemed like remorse, but in a detached way that made people question whether he genuinely understood the magnitude of what he had done. In 2019, after serving more than 26 years in prison, Jean-Claude Ramond became eligible to apply for parole. His request for release was considered by French parole authorities, who had to evaluate whether he still posed a danger to society. The families of his victims strongly opposed his release, arguing that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life, given the horrific nature of his crimes. The case received renewed media attention as the parole decision was pending. The parole board ultimately granted Jean-Claude conditional release in 2019. He was released from prison, but with strict conditions, including regular check-ins with authorities, restrictions on where he could live, and ongoing psychological treatment. The decision to release him was controversial. Many people felt that someone who had murdered 5 family members, including 2 young children, should never be released from prison. Others argued that the French criminal justice system is built on the principle of rehabilitation, and that Jean-Claude had served his minimum sentence and met the legal requirements for release. Since his release, Jean-Claude has lived quietly under an assumed name. The conditions of his parole prohibit him from contacting any members of his victims' families or speaking publicly about his case. He is now an elderly man, nearly 70 years old, who has spent most of his adult life either maintaining his fraudulent double life or in prison for the murders that ended it. The remainder of his life will be lived in obscurity, though his name remains infamous in France as one of the country's most notorious family annihilators. The 5 people Jean-Claude Ramond murdered never got to live the lives they should have had. Florence was 37 years old when her husband killed her. She had been a devoted mother who believed she was married to a successful professional. 7-year-old Antoine and 5-year-old Caroline were innocent children who trusted their father and had no way to protect themselves when he decided to kill them. Aime and Anne-Marie Romand were elderly parents who had worked hard to give their son opportunities and who died at his hands without understanding why. The Romand case remains a subject of fascination and study decades after the murders. It raises profound questions about identity, deception, shame, and violence. How does someone maintain a completely fake life for 18 years? What psychological mechanisms allow someone to lie so thoroughly and consistently? At what point does the fear of being exposed become so overwhelming that murder seems like a solution? These questions have been explored by numerous writers, filmmakers, and researchers who have examined the case. The case also highlights the terrible consequences that can result from an inability or unwillingness to face failure and admit mistakes. Jean-Claude's entire nightmare began with his failure to take one exam in medical school. If he had simply admitted this failure to his family and friends, his life would have taken a different path. He might have retaken the exam, or pursued a different career, or found some other way forward. Instead, he chose to lie, and that single lie grew into a monstrous deception that consumed 18 years and ultimately resulted in 5 murders. Jean-Claude Ramond will be remembered as a man who destroyed his entire family rather than admit he had been living a lie. His case serves as an extreme example of how shame, pride, and fear of judgment can drive someone to commit unspeakable acts. The murders he committed were not crimes of passion or the result of a sudden loss of control. They were calculated acts carried out by someone who had spent nearly 2 decades perfecting the art of deception, and who chose murder over honesty when his lies finally caught up with him. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.